Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is The Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 61, Ruth. X. You idiot. How could you get injured? I thought you had your arrow. Rukia lectured and exclaimed at the same time, hovering over Ichigo with all the menacing presence of the devil incarnate etched into the fury of her features and in the mean presence, one likely cultivated with Anohana's help, filling the room. Ichigo cautiously shied away from the angered midget and continued to let her rant, the words washing over him and filling the room like a buzzing storm of sharp barbs. He would interject when she had settled somewhat in her rant. In the meantime, it was best to simply brace himself, let the nagging wear itself out and continue wrapping the wound on his back with a bit of effort. The wound, for Rukia's information, wasn't serious in the slightest, or at least not to Ichigo's more battle-inclined senses. In reality, it was more of a flesh wound in all seriousness, and though it would leave a scar, a wide spread of discolored skin spreading across his side, it wasn't like he didn't have 100 others, some that actually ached in the chill, or pulled at his muscles on occasion. The female lieutenant had stared for a long drawn-out moment when she had stomped into the room, after Kisuke had informed her of his injury, darting as fast as possible in the early morning from the Kurosaki household, to stumble upon Ichigo with his Shiakusho splayed to the side. The orange-haired Shinigami had been attempting to wrap his own wound because he was not letting Kisuke and his sloppy skills attempt anything, when the woman entered. The man was a genius at sewing or mechanics, but wrapping wounds were and had always been Tessai's speciality. Ichigo jerked from drifting thoughts as Rukia waved a hand in front of his eyes, a frown furrowing her brows and curving her lips as her eyes asked if he had even been paying attention while she had been talking with all the morality of an expectant positive answer. Rubbing a hand over his features, Ichigo sighed and attempted to twist his torso, checking his maneuverability as he responded with a hint of a hiss and a lesson in his voice. Rukia, even the best of us get injured sometimes. It was a surprise attack. But I'm fine, the wound is superficial and later I'll finish applying the healing Kido needed, alright? I know you're upset you weren't there to fight with me, but sometimes we can't predict the future or the actions of others. Rukia glanced up from where her gaze had drifted to stare at the ground during Ichigo's impromptu encouraging and reassuring speech. The midget had serious eyes, shining with a thin veneer of vulnerability that came with being a metaphysical teenager, even if in reality she was over 100 years old. There was a reason the Ichigo and Rukia of his timeline had gotten along so well, and it wasn't just their abrasive personalities. Shaking his head in fondness, Ichigo reached out and ruffled the Kukaki's hair and received a petulant glare and a swat at his arm. Ichigo just grinned in response and settled comfortably once more at the low table, sipping at the tea one of the Shinigami on loan had made. They had decent skills, and decent was far better than what meager attempts Kisuke managed to scrounge up. Studying the lieutenant in front of him, Ichigo idly thought on how Rukia had matured and changed since the war, and even before the war in meeting the twins. She was far less stiff and private with those that she cared for, as it had always been, and Hisona's touch had also been beyond beneficial in shaping the kind nature Rukia often guarded with an icy shell. But she also understood life, and in extension the role of honor, a lot better, not that she still didn't suffer moments of propriety or teenager angst/insecurity. Thinking of teenagers, Ichigo tilted his head and asked, "Are you going to attend the high school again while we're here?" Rukia glanced up from the table where she had been studying the swirling wood grains, half startled at his question, as if she had expected Ichigo to command her focus onto the mission at hand or maybe pretend her friendship with the twins didn't exist. Ichigo suppressed a laugh at the expression, even as the midget narrowed her eyes in suspicious before asking, "Why?" "It would give you more time to hang out with the Kurosaki siblings and their friends. In addition, you would be able to protect them easily from the Bount if they attack if you're with them near all the time." Ichigo explained with a kind knowing smile, feeling for a moment remarkably old and like Yukatake or Kairo Raku, as Rukia's eyes visibly lit up across from him in a way that made Ichigo's heart flutter as much in fondness as in remembrance of nights swinging about Rungokai and ducking into whatever shop caught the midget's eyes. Glancing at a mostly correct, missing a few parts and half-assembled, clock on the pale beige walls, Ichigo smirked in mischief and announced, "Then you better hurry, school starts in half an hour." Rukia glanced at him like a deer in headlights, or a person catching sight of some towering indomitable wave. She spared a moment to glare fiercely at Ichigo with all the ice inside her small soul before she darted from the table and shut the door with a slam as if Hell's gates were upon her heels. At the thought of hell and all its trials, Ichigo rested his head on the table with a thunk, and let his eyes lazily slid to the cup of tea, wisps of steam curling lazily and blissfully unaware of life. A moment later the door slid open with a quiet rattle that belayed the scientist's refusal to buy new doors even when the 50-year-old ones were falling apart. Lifting his head from the table, Ichigo blinked blearily at Kisuke leaning casually against the doorway with a coy-knowing smile, the kind that had near constantly decorated the man's features when he was plotting, or in on a plot as the circumstances often were. Now why was Kukaki-san running about so frantically? The blonde questioned in intrigue as he glided into the room and seated himself at the table with all the grace of a predator and yet at the same time harnessing his inner sloth, taking a drink from Ichigo's tea before frowning at the contents, likely not enough sugar. Ichigo debated briefly on remaining silent just to see the man's petulance at not having his curiosity satisfied before with a resolute sigh accompanied by a grin the orange-haired captain answered, "She's getting ready for high school, which starts in half an hour." The man made a sound of gleeful acknowledgement before pulling out a device from somewhere within his sleeve. Ichigo ignored the other sounds of shuffling and vague crinkling that preceded the process and instead decided to study his tea, closely guarded to his chest, as if it held the secrets to the universe. Before the steaming liquid could swallow his conscious whole, the door once more slammed open and Rukia appeared panting and a touch wild-eyed. Her gaze landed with all the ferocity of a starving animal on Kisuke, who only glanced up once before casually commenting, "In the closet on your left with the rainbow stickers, ignore the other bodies." Rukia nodded unperturbed, yelled, "Bye," and was gone in the next second, the sound of the front door sliding close echoing throughout the shodan. It was followed briefly by a lingering silence that swelled and rose to a crescendo as once more Ichigo let the tea absorb his thoughts. "Kisuke?" Ichigo questioned pensively, glancing up to study the scientist who was reading whatever data the device he was holding was displaying with eyes alight like a fire. The blonde glanced up and with a waggle of his brow asked, "Yes, Ichi-kun. Technically we're about the same age." Ichigo responded to the ending typically used for those younger, with a shake of his head at the man's antics. It was mostly true if one included Ichigo's years lived in the past timeline. Regardless of the fact he was still one of the youngest captains, which many others did not hesitate to lord over his head, though Toshiro would change that. The scientist chuckled and fixed the captain with a knowing look before gesturing for Ichigo to continue with his question. "If some of the bound want to find safety here at the shodan, would that be okay?" Ichigo asked quietly, almost demurely, with a quirk of his head, something asking of his friend in his voice. Kisuke stared at Ichigo with Athena gray eyes, stroking the stubble on his chin that Yuriyuki both hated and loved, in thought as he considered the idea, likely plotting out experiments or some way to turn the freeloaders into his personal scapegoats. "I don't see why not. What about Soul Society though?" Kisuke finally responded after drawing out the tension for a few moments of sadistic pleasure as the man was wont to do. At the question, Ichigo curled his looks, something defiant washing over his features in challenge. At the familiar expression Kisuke chuckled, features lighting up. He commented and reassured, "I doubt we'll have to worry, considering you're the golden boy of Soul Society." Ichigo tilting his head at the strange nickname, one he hadn't heard before, Ichigo furrowed his brow in curiosity. He knew he had many names, some relating to his hair, others his mysterious nature. He knew he was something of a legend, like most of the Godai 13 upper hierarchy, among the citizens of Rungokai, but being called the Golden Boy was certainly a first. Kisuke laughed uproariously at Ichigo's expression, lips forming a broad grin as he shook his head in fond amusement and replied, "You are quite favored among the upper echelon of Soul Society, Ichigo. For Kami's sake, the Suteiko practically adopted you." Ichigo made a vague "oh" sound in realization before he shrugged in acceptance. It wasn't as if his goals in Soul Society had been to curry favor with the higher UPS, it had more been in the nature of seeking relationships and personalities he was familiar with. Kisuke shook his head, where he was studying Ichigo, with the sort of bespectacled look the orange-haired Shinigami was often fixed with when someone discovered yet another of his impossible truths. Before the conversation could continue, a ringing tune, not unlike a cell phone, filled the room, and Kisuke with dignity and integrity shuffled through his sleeves, near endless in their capacity for space, and pulled out another device. The scientist studied the small box with serious gray eyes before he glanced at Ichigo and commented, "Looks like the cavalry is arriving." Ichigo nodded and suppressed a groan, mustering the strength to stand as half of him was torn with elation that the rest of the Shinigami were arriving, even as another part of him dreaded the incoming chaos. Allowing the scientist to exit the room first, Ichigo dutifully followed the blonde into the courtyard of the Shoten, bathed in the soft hues of early morning casting the earth in tones of a dream. With a swell of Ryotsu, familiar shoji doors materialized with all the bearing and elegance Ichigo had long since become familiar with as the doors slid open to reveal 4 silhouettes. Shinji followed by 3 lieutenants strolled casually into the courtyard, eyes sweeping about and observing his surroundings before landing on Ichigo. Rangiku on the left of the blonde was surveying the living world with bright eyes, sparkling with excitement yet cut with seriousness beneath like polished diamonds. Jin a half step behind his girlfriend was carefully allowing his gaze to flick from Rangiku to Ichigo with all the beady predatory motions of a snake studying one's prey. Ichigo decided it had been a wise choice to invite Jin along. Lisa was on Shinji's right, occasionally fixing both blonde Shinigami with an irritated expression before letting her gaze land on Ichigo with a soft sort of fondness. "Ichigo, what's this I've been hearing about vampires?" Shinji questioned casually with a sly quality to his gaze as he paused in front of Ichigo and Kisuke, trading the scientist with one of his Cheshire grins before allowing the full force of his focus to land on Ichigo. The orange-haired captain shook his head in rueful amusement and tactfully avoided the question for the moment by responding, "Hello to you to Shinji." "Hello Jin, Rangiku, Lisa. Thank you all for coming." Shinji squawked outrageously at the dismissal of his question, and blatantly his existence, as Lisa in the background muffled her laughter into her hand before waving quietly at Ichigo with eyes alight with amusement. Rangiku looked close to hugging Ichigo simply to see her captain squirm again, or just for fondness sake, but in the end, to Ichigo's gratitude, only winked in greeting and blew a kiss. Jin, undeterred by Rangiku's actions, shot Ichigo a sly fox grin in greeting, eyes still wide open for all their shut appearance in the same manner as always, though Ichigo sensed a hint of amusement from the young prodigy. Returning his attention to Shinji, who was staring at Ichigo in affront, glancing between the youth and Kisuke as if trying to convey his emotions to the scientist, the orange-haired captain shook his head and swatted his friend upside the head with a pointed look. Shinji hissed but relented with a pout, eyes glimmering with a promise that Ichigo knew he would pay for later. Rolling his eyes with a shrug of his shoulders, Ichigo considered the group of Shinigami and asked, "What do you know about the Bount?" At the mention of their enemy and the mission at hand, the Shinigami hardened, the easy aura of camaraderie dropping away to be replaced by the ancient guardians of the afterlife. Shinji, amber eyes glowing in promise and battle lust, considered Ichigo for a moment before replying, "We had a captain's meeting yesterday. Lot of it was all case of emergency procedures, yeah, know the deal." Suteiko stated, "Yeah, we're already there, and we were following to handle it." What Shinji is dallying to say is that Aizen Teiko informed us that the Bount are a mod soul experiment gone wrong. They feed on human souls to gain power and are seeking a way to enter soul society to gain revenge. Lisa interrupted, the 2 other wizards knowing of Shinji's tendency to embellish at times, or just procrastinate the source material in general. Ichigo nodded in thanks to his former co-lieutenant, who grinned in promise, hand straying to the hilt of her Zanpakuto. Shinji glanced between the 2, mouth opening and closing before he frowned and muttered petulantly about mutiny. Kisuke shuffled over to the other blonde and pet his shoulder in a vaguely consoling manner. Rangiku giggled at their squabbling even as Jin watched everything with curiosity and amusement. "I've explained most of this twice over, Kisuke, you can finish briefing," the orange-haired captain stated sharply with a crisp nod towards the blonde scientist, who studied Ichigo from under the brim of his hat with dark eyes before nodding. What Ichigo had spoken was true. He was more than tired of explaining the whole situation, and if he could shove that responsibility on Kisuke, he would do so gladly. Kariya is the leader of the Bount. Currently they are located in a mansion on the outskirts of town. Ichigo's reconnaissance reported 10 Bount, though there are 9 now, as Ichigo engaged in battle with 2 early this morning and killed 1. He was injured by the way. In any case, their goal is to access a Quincy to enter Soul Society, where they will be stronger due to the Reisu-saturated air. I, in my brilliance, have created mod souls that can sense their presence. And that's about all, other than the fact that 1 or more of them might desert if we so provide the opportunity. Kisuke spoke cheerfully with a hint of mischievous malice as he pronounced reconnaissance with all the hint needed that anyone knowing Ichigo's true past would so desire to clue into the man's reference, before declaring Ichigo's wound with a sort of vindictive joy. The orange-haired captain scrubbed a hand over his features as both Lisa and Shinji's gaze, along with Rangeka though she was mild in her concern, swung to Ichigo with all the concerned force of a mother bear protecting their children, almost silently demanding to see the wound or cart him off to Anohana. What Kisuk failed to mention was that the injury was minor and is almost completely healed already. Ichigo bit back, the placating words settling the two slightly, though Ichigo knew Shinji would likely still demand to see the wound in any case. Rangeka, a puzzled expression on her features, reflecting the cunning mind often hidden behind the pretty exterior, studied both the orange-haired captain and the scientist before asking, "Nay, how many Quincy are in Karakura town?" "There are 7. Kisuk stared without inflection as if the existence of Quincy after the genocide of the Blood War was normal and not something to report to Seoul society in the slightest. None of the Shinigami reacted with shock to the information, which Ichigo was internally grateful for, even as Shinji narrowed his eyes in thought, more of the tactical kind, while Jin and Rangeka spoke in hushed tones, and Lisa sidled beside Ichigo. "Are you really okay, Ichigo?" the young woman asked, concern born of their long friendship saturating her voice. Ichigo nodded, unhesitant, glancing into her eyes to reassure her for a moment before he fixed his gaze upon Kisuk. The scientist was fiddling with the device but paused under the weight of Ichigo's gaze and nodded imperceptibly, once more handing the reins of control to the young captain. Ichigo coughed once loudly, obviously, gaining the attention of the Shinigami still standing in the warm light of mid-morning, and stated, "For the moment we're going to patrol the streets of Karakura to stop the Bount from attacking any souls. If you can, try and convert some of the Bount from their mission to destroy Seoul society. We'll muster an attack on the mansion within the next few days. I should probably warn you guys now, there is a Shinigami who deserted WI." Ichigo trailed off as the door to the Shoten teetered open and Ryren in the bird plushie and blue outfit hopped out at the same time as one of Kisuk's devices began to sing-song about the danger in a squealing high pitch. The Mod Soul beelined towards the group of Shinigami and in her chirping voice announced, "The Bounts have attacked the high school." Kisuk glanced up from his device and nodded his acquiesce to the news. Ichigo dragged a hand over his face with a low curse and turned to face the gathered Shinigami, all who faced him with the eyes of determined warriors, Reisu humming throughout the air. Shaking his head in rueful amusement, Ichigo let another curse, one directed at fate, slip out under his breath before he turned and faced Kisuk. "Send Yoryuki to make sure their families are okay." The scientist tipped his head in acknowledgement of the command, and some part of Ichigo's heart rested easier knowing they would be okay. With Shiro chanting bloodlust in his ear, and Asen resonating reassurance, Ichigo turned to the gathered Shinigami and instructed with a bloodthirsty grin, "Follow me." Ichigo arrived first, landing in front of the school with a whirl of dust and caution clinging to every line of his body. The orange-haired captain quickly surveyed the area, Reisu reaching out and sweeping for any hostile presences before searching for familiar ones, eyes hard as steel as Zanjutsu hung unsheathed at his side, the blade humming in anticipation. The other Shinigami landed behind Ichigo, as silent as the wind that blew through the near-empty courtyard, presences like silver muffled by cloth. At first glance everything appeared normal in the midday sun, the squat school building towering above them as students studied in their classes and the city around them inhaled and exhaled. But as Ichigo listened closely, he could hear the faint sounds of a battle lost somewhere behind the high school that sent nostalgia rippling through his core as he recalled the many adventures, some more mischievous than others, that had occurred in Karakura. Glancing back at his companions, Ichigo caught the eyes of the Shinigami, determination reflecting like hardened glass in all their eyes. He moved his head once to direct them to follow his movement before allowing Flash Step to carry his feet forward. Great arcs of ice decorated the courtyard, filling the air with glittering spirals that shone and reflected like a kaleidoscope as water whirled about, sending the crystalline figures crashing to the pavement. The Water Twins, who had attacked Uryu in the hospital in Ichigo's timeline, were facing Rukia, who held Sode no Shirayuki in its unsealed form, Chad standing beside the young woman in silent support, as he fired blasts of energy at the twins to distract them. On the other side of the field, the twins and Uryu faced Gokoga and his doll. Karen and Uryu were firing Quincy arrows, or well, Karen's equivalent of arrows, they were more sword-like, at the metal doll. The condensed Reishi was guided truly, but most skittered off the metal with a shower of sparks, unsuccessful at piercing the thick metal but able to immobilize the almost spider-like creature's limbs temporarily. At the same time, Yuzo chanted a mix of Bakudo and Hado, firing both at the doll and the Bount, flashes of light as a Shakuho, followed by a Byakurai, and a sigh filled the air. Ichigo was beyond glad the twins had refrained from unsheathing their Zanpakuto in the fight, relying on their Quincy powers, even if it painted a larger target on their backs for the bout. It protected their family and unwanted inquiries. There would already be questions about Quincy living in Karakura Town, but Shinigami Quincy Hollow hybrids were not something Soul Society needed to discover yet. He was still waiting for the day when he revealed his own biology. "Lieutenant Kukaki, need some assistance?" Ichigo called out with a grin as Shinji stepped up beside the orange-haired captain, observing their enemies and their allies with careful interest clouded with bloodlust, noting with a careful tactical strength the abilities of both sides. In a dramatic flair, that Shinji had likely coordinated the three lieutenants fanned out behind the two captains, presenting a united front to the bout. Rukia jerked and her eyes harshly caught Ichigo's in surprise as Sode no Shirayuki coated the ground in a thin layer of ice, followed by large pillars spearing the air around the bout twins, and Chad fired his Reisu towards one of the twins. The female lieutenant scowled at Ichigo and rolled her eyes as if offended he had offered help, even if beneath it all she looked relieved at their appearance. Ichigo ignored the vague sense of déjà vu and instead winked at the lieutenant and flash-stepped across the courtyard to catch one of the metal doll's large spider-like limbs on the naked blade of Zanjutsu. Taking his movement as a sign of action, the other Shinigami darted forward, Ranjaku, Jin, and Lisa stepping forward to aid Rukia and Chad in a touch of overkill as Shinji appeared beside Ichigo with a broad carefree grin. As Ichigo strained against the weight of the metal doll over his shoulder, he called out in greeting to the three teens standing somewhat in a stupor behind him, "Hello Yuzue, Karin, Urayu, nice to see you all again so soon." "Ichi and we could have handled it," Karin replied in greeting as she crossed her arms over her chest before, with a determined frown that was almost eerily familiar, she once more materialized her bow and fired at a stray limb that had inched its way towards Shinji's neck. The blonde nodded in thanks with a grin even as the metal doll skidded back at the force of a rapid combo of attacks Ichigo released in the intermediary their arrival had created. The doll rolled back unfazed by the deep gouges in the metal, and with a shift as if something out of alchemy the doll merged into the form of a machine gun. Ichigo had only a moment to erect a Kido shield spanning across the teens and Shinji before the makeshift bullets collided with the shield, with all the weight of shards of ice crashing to the ground. "Go Koga, if you surrender now, Soul Society will be lenient, you will be allowed to live in the mortal realm or seek shelter elsewhere. Soul Society does not wish to destroy the bout, the genocide of a race, they have forsaken that path. Soul Society wants to make reparations for their mistakes, for the suffering they have caused your race. But if you seek revenge against Soul Society, then we have no choice but to stop you." Ichigo yelled over the roar of the machine guns, commanding attention with his eyes and the fire in his voice, as Urayu and Karin huddled behind a shield Yuzu had erected, one that remained standing even in the face of the assault, stared at him with wide eyes. The large bout jerked to the side at Ichigo's words as if the vitriol of Soul Society had been the only words the bout had expected to hear. "Go Koga," leveled Ichigo with a slow searching gaze, the heat of battle suspended as if by a swinging pocket watch, ticking away every second thought. At the same time, Ichigo felt Shinji's own confused gaze at his side, the blonde likely questioning why they were offering such an option to the faction that, like many others, sought vengeance on Soul Society. Ichigo wished there had been more time to explain the situation to the Shinigami before the attack had happened, explain how they were the last of their race, how most had been killed by or had outlived the humans surrounding them. But the orange-haired Shinigami knew fate was never so easy, always sliding from one path to another, twisting around itself in great tangles almost like an Ouroboros in nature. The bout continued to search Ichigo's eyes, searching for honesty, questioning the veracity of his words with a fragile denied hope and acceptance, even as stone-cold logic tickled into place and a frown burrowed across the man's features and the doll morphed from a machine gun to a cloud of small metal spheres that shot forward in answer to Ichigo's warning. The orange-haired captain muted a sigh, knowing in the end hopefully he would be able to save a few members of the dying race. He never wanted to see extinction of that kind again, or on the level of the end of the world. With Zanjutsu rushing through his ears and veins like the sea, Ichigo released a Getsuga Tensho that cut through the sea of metal orbs like Moses through the Red Sea in a brilliant arc of black Reisu before charging towards the buff male bout. The Getsuga Tensho slammed against a wall of metal as the bounce doll reformed, protecting her wielder and leaving him unharmed as the spider-like form once more emerged into existence. Dropping the Kido surrounding them, Ichigo traded a glance with Shinji before he ordered the teenagers behind him in a calm but clearly commanding voice, "Stay back and provide support, try to subdue the Bount. If you stop him, the doll will stop its attacks. Yuzo nodded in firm agreement, and Uriah followed the motion. Even as Karen looked on the border of rebelliously ignoring his instructions, she nodded, understanding and seriousness collecting in her eyes. Ichigo grinned and returned his attention to the battle even as he ducked an overhead swing from a blade-like limb and Shinji darted underneath to slash at the doll's unprotected side. Ichigo responded by firing a Byakurai through the doll's head, knowing that even with a multitude of attacks the metal being would simply separate and reform unless its wielder was stopped. Ichigo was peripherally aware of the others fighting the Water Twins, and the three teenagers behind him aiding in their fight with conveniently placed Kido arrows and attempting to restrain the male Bount. In unison, the two captains dodged and slashed, moving in an easy tandem that had developed as they trained their inner hollows in an abandoned cave and fought on the sands of Hueco Mundo. Releasing a slightly overpowered Getsuga Tensho at the doll, forcing it to once more separate into its spherical form, Ichigo whipped around, instincts buzzing on the border of his senses as a large gust of wind hurtled towards the teenagers, still rallied in a pyramid formation. With a tug on Zanjutsu's power, Ichigo released another Getsuga Tensho, the black Reisu tangling inside the wind as he used Shunpo to appear in front of the teenagers, unprepared for the sudden attack. Kariya stood in front of him, leaning casually against one of the school chain-linked fences, white hair gleaming like polished marble in the sunlight, as Yoshino hovered behind the leader of the Bount along with another female Bount with slicked green hair and a crimson fan. Part of Ichigo felt sympathy and a touch of empathy for the man in front of him, for the immortality and the duress of time upon one's sanity, for watching one's entire race fall, and for all he had lost. But another part of Ichigo had already long ago accepted that some people were beyond saving, but sometimes even those thought beyond saving if given a chance could try. Well, if it isn't the Shinigami captain who killed Yutagawa. The man stated in a slow, elegant drawl, stepping casually into the sunlight as if to put at bay any myths of sunlight weakening their powers. Position commanding and powerful as a hush fell over the battlefield at the arrival of the Bount's leader. Ichigo straightened out of the battle stance he had slid into and faced the man, letting his eyes stare into depths tattered with insanity. He responded, "Jin Kariya. Oh, you know of me? Then you know we seek vengeance on Soul Society for this half-life they have doomed us to, for our existence, for shunting us out the door and never looking back." Kariya responded, words of fever even as they were said with staid cool elegance. The Bounts in the courtyard looked to their leader with almost adoring eyes, as if blind to the madness, all except for Yoshino and a few others who hid their gaze as well, while acting attentive to their leader listened with wary caution. Ichigo frowned at the statement as the Shinigami in the courtyard tightened at the tides of war swelling about their feet, and the eyes of both sides slid to the Quincy in the courtyard. Shinji and Lisa were standing protectively near the twins and Uriah as if challenging someone to take a step closer. Soul Society was wrong. They shouldn't have abandoned the Bount. And Soul Society is willing to make reparations, to accept our faults. We failed, and we know it. We don't seek war, and if any of you, anyone at all, wishes to stop fighting, then we will not attack you. We can even offer you shelter. Jin Kariya, you have lived to see the near extinction of your race, and madness of any slight is understandable, but please consider stopping your quest for vengeance. You don't need to sacrifice yourselves, your lives have meaning. Ichigo's words were slow and clear, burning with a hidden passion that was forcibly kept on a simmer, as much as he wanted to yell at them that they shouldn't waste their lives on a foolish endeavor of vengeance, or preach Soul Society's changes. He knew that it was like throwing sand at a brick wall. However useless in most cases, Ichigo knew some of the Bount in the courtyard, and likely those hidden in wait to aid their comrades had heard his words. Yoshino stood stock still behind Kariya, gaze darting to the man, expectantly waiting for his response in a way that belied the way one knew an old lover's heart, even as her gaze flickered to Ichigo in contemplation of his words and offer of a hand, however faint, for her to take. Kariya in response, faltered for a fraction of a moment, gaze confused before he tipped his head back and laughed, the sound grating and rustling throughout the courtyard, sending shivers down Ichigo's spine even as he stared silent and with all the posture of a stone guardian at the leader. Peace? Forgiveness? No. The Bount will have their vengeance and create a new paradise for our race, one where the Quincy will not be prosecuted, and the Shinigami will be gone. We will do so if we have to kill every soul before us to gain the power. Kariya spoke, eyes almost glowing, as the Bount shifted in agreement and many in the courtyard shifted in surprise. Yoshino's eyes widened with dawning realization at the true extent of madness the white-haired Bount held. Ichigo's shoulders slumped in partial defeat even as Zanjutsu was shifted in his hands with a resonating acceptance, and as the sun was shadowed by passing clouds the battle recommenced with a great surge and heave of Reisu. Ichigo and Kariya studied each other in a tense silence, one that raged and rippled around them as Rukia and Chad continued to deal with the water twins, Ranjaku and Jin teamed up to deal with the fan-wielding Bount, Lisa aided the three teens, and Shinji darted forward to deal with Yoshino. The standoff lasted only a moment before the air stilled and then began to swirl, snatching at Ichigo's Shiakusho and pulling at his limbs. In response, Ichigo flared his Reisu, allowing it to coat his body in arcs of thick ebony that braided and twisted with the wind as Kariya charged forward with a snarl written across his features. Zanjutsu snapped up to deflect the harsh blasts of wind that cut like a scythe through the air as Kariya maintained a barrier like solid glass around himself and summoned a handful of tornadoes with a deranged laugh. The young captain grit his teeth in determination and waited till the tunnels of wind were almost within arm's reach before releasing a Getsuga Tensho. The energy spiraled through the air and cut through the tornadoes, merging with the heavy wind even as Ichigo darted through the stormy arrow tugged tightly to his skin. It was at times like these Ichigo desperately wished for an elemental Zanpakuto sword, as while Zanjutsu was amazing when faced with certain elements, raw energy wasn't always enough to completely combat its effects, or it was just damn tricky. As Ichigo cleared the winds whipping about, Zanjutsu snapped up to deflect a bolt of lightning that arched off the blade, glowing like a lightsaber in Kariya's hands. With furrowed brows, Ichigo dodged another bolt of lightning and released a low-powered Getsuga Tensho followed by a Byakurai in an attempt to pierce the barrier surrounding the leader of the Bount. Kariya let the attacks clash against his wind barrier in a screaming collision of two forces raging against one another, one a supposedly immovable object, and the other an unstoppable force. It was vindictively pleasing to watch surprise skitter across Jin Kariya's features when a large crack appeared in the barrier. Before Ichigo could press his advantage, the white-haired Bount charged forward, blade crackling ominously as the sky overhead shuddered in warning. Zanjutsu caught the blade that was simultaneously heavy and light with ease as Reisu coated the sealed blade, and Ichigo struggled against Kariya's strength. A moment later they sprung apart before Kariya charged swinging overhead, as Ichigo raised Zanjutsu to catch the blade, which flowed to a quick reverse, aiming for Ichigo's chest. The orange-haired Shinigami twisted fluidly out of the way even as Zanjutsu snapped out towards the white-haired Bount's neck, only to be stopped by a swell of air that caught Zanjutsu like a wall of ice. Flicking his blade back towards his center, Ichigo caught Kariya's next attack with a grind of metal that produced sparks and small spits of lightning that rent the air between the two fighters, supercharged and seeped in tension. Ichigo allowed Reisu to pool beneath his fingers, negating the effects of the lightning so close to his skin and threatening to electrify him, and charging a point-blank Getsuga Tensho, Ichigo released it with a grin. The attack slammed into a hastily erected wind barrier, sending the Bount hurtling halfway across the courtyard even as a scurry of tornadoes formed into existence in retaliation. Kariya stumbled to his feet, appearance tousled even as flames of madness collapsed across his face, and the Bount hurled across the courtyard, following his attack, blade raised to harm as lightning slashed at the ground around Ichigo in an increasingly intimidating manner. Ichigo cut through the tornadoes, ignored the lightning and surged forward to catch the blade. The two opponents struggled against the other, opposing strengths sliding one blade close to the other's chest as Ichigo grit his teeth at the lightning, attempting to strike him only to meet with his arrow or a well-timed dodge as Ichigo slid away and re-engaged Kariya. They continued to clash, as throughout the courtyard the other Shinigami and Bount battled, the sounds of fighting a great cacophony that ebbed and flowed along with the Reisu filling the air in an oppressive manner, like a thick summer heat drifting and settling over one's shoulders. As Ichigo paced a half-step back, noting Kariya's wearing demeanor as the leader attempted to keep up with Ichigo's stamina, the orange-haired Shinigami felt the atmosphere tense, though the sound of battle still raged on. Something lingered. Ichigo's eyes subtly swept the courtyard as he blocked an overhead strike from Kariya and retorted with a slash towards the man's midsection. As his eyes swept through the battle, his senses flared in warning, in a way that was both distinctly unfamiliar to Ichigo and yet horrid in its sense, because Ichigo was used to trusting his instincts in regard to protecting himself in battle, but when they were blaring to protect others. Without conscious thought, Ichigo was moving a blur across the courtyard to intercept a Zanpakuto that had appeared a snake in the sunlight as it had crept through the long grasses of battle. The twins and Urayu jerked in shock behind Ichigo, even as the orange-haired captains stared into the flint-hardened eyes of the deserter Ichinos. The man was staring at Ichigo with vaguely muted shock at having his attack intercepted, the Shinigami likely planning to sweep in and snatch the girls or Uriah while no one was looking. It made Ichigo's blood boil in a way that lingered in a horrible sensation that pulled at his senses like he was once more an adolescent. Tamping down on the rage and protective instincts rearing their foul and proud head, Ichigo jerked Ichino's Zanpakuto away, and in the lingering silence his interruption had caused asked the man, "You're a Shinigami. Why are you fighting against us?" Ichino's wrinkled a brow, an expression of loathing seeped with anger slipping across his features as he responded, "The Shinigami are nothing but bloodthirsty savages who care nothing for justice or law. I watched my captain slain, just so another could take his place." The deserter spoke in a serious tone as their wills strained against one another. Ichigo frowned at the man's statement even as the tension drifting through the air began to gather like a storm swelling on the horizon. Soul Society is nothing like that anymore, once perhaps but not so now. We have a militia in Rungokai and better care in general. Though I suppose you are from the 11th Division? Ichigo questioned and Ichino said nothing, eyes flickering with something hesitant and thoughtful before he scowled and let his Zanpakuto swing out and whip towards Ichigo's neck with a rapid metal slicing cruelly through the air. Ichigo twisted aside and pivoted as Kariya appeared behind Ichigo, too close to the twins for the orange-haired captain's liking. Zanjutsu humming through his body and mind, Ichigo released a powerful Getsuga Tensho. In the next second, Ichigo flicked Zanjutsu to catch Ichino's Zanpakuto and sent a binding Kido over his shoulder toward Kariya. The tension in the air reached a rapid crescendo as an elegant pair of shoji doors opened in the courtyard and Renji glided out, followed closely by Ikeka with all the ceremonial bang of 1,000 gongs. The man grinned at Rukia, and Ichigo ignored other thoughts of the redhead, memories drifting in a familiar wave to the surface, as the brash Shinigami called out, "Need a bit of help." At the appearance of the two Shinigami, Kariya traded a glance with Ichino's, loaded with unsaid words and a hint of sanity masked in taciturn sensibility, before he gestured for a retreat. The deserter Shinigami made one last attempt to strike through Ichigo's defense as lightning slammed into Ichigo from the other side. The orange-haired Shinigami carelessly battered Ichino's Zanpakuto away, tired of useless games and attempting to convince people of wavering loyalties, and called out, "The offer of sanctuary still stands, whether the bout die out is your decision." With those parting words the bout dispersed, Yoshino casting an aspiring look to Ichigo before following Kariya. Koga paused long enough to study Ichigo intently before he left as well. The young captain's shoulders slumped minutely at the retreat of their opponents as he turned around to appraise the state of the twins and Uriah. They looked a little worse for the wear but overall seemed exhilarated in the post-battle adrenaline glow. "Are you all okay?" the orange-haired captain questioned, directing the query to all the souls gathered in the courtyard as the others shook off the presence of battle. Karin and Yuzo shared a silent look, communication a flawless working between the two before they nodded with mirroring smiles, one a touch more bloodthirsty than the other. Uriah nodded briefly in assurance, clipped and pristine as always even as his eyes carefully observed his cousin's states. Shinji sidled over to stand beside Ichigo to survey the surprisingly minimal damage to the courtyard, as Rukia hit Renji upside the head for coming at all. Ranjaku and Jin conversed in soft tones even as the flamboyant lieutenant waved happily at her captain, noticing Ichigo's gaze. Chad stood beside the twins, a silent but sure presence, and Lisa ignored Ikeka whining about missing the battle and had instead pulled out a novel from somewhere within her Shiakusho. "Quite the characters, Ichi." The blonde drawled casually as Ichigo sheathed Zanjutsu with a nod, thoughts drifting over the battle and attempting to analyze what could have been said differently if there was something he perhaps could have done to stop the extinction of the bounce. As if sensing his dark thoughts, Shinji clasped a hand on Ichigo's shoulder, forcefully drawing him from spiraling trails, and with a wide grin admonished, "Come, let's go help with the cleaning, and then you can introduce me to the fearsome four over there." Ichigo muffled his laughter into his sleeve at the name and nodded, pushing aside his worries for the moment to focus on the people surrounding him. The young captain had a feeling everything wasn't quite as finished to plan as it yet seemed. The knock was quiet, almost a whisper in the warmth of the Shoten as the gathered Shinigami piled about the room, chatting, sharing tea and humorous stories that left others blushing in embarrassment, and generally ribbing each other. Ichigo glanced around and noticed he was one of the only ones to hear it among the happy post-battle incessant noise, other than Lisa, whose keen eyes tracked the orange-haired captain as he rose gracefully to his feet and slipped from the room in the imitation of a passing shadow. The female lieutenant followed him, solid and reassuring in a way that had been built in his first life and honed to a fine needlepoint when they had served under the same captain. They didn't speak as they made their way to the front of the Shoten, the candy store front. There was a certain understanding in the air between them and a lack of need for communication as their Zanpakuto glinted in a sliver of promise. Ichigo opened the door slowly, cautiously, only to take a half-step back in shock when he glimpsed the pale form of Yoshino, hair tangled about her features and eyes sorrowful. She stared first at Ichigo with something both hostile and hopeful before her gaze drifted past the orange-haired Shinigami to Lisa. "I'm sorry. Kariya, he wanted to consume too many souls, and he wanted to sacrifice me. And I was so lost, there was no other option." The female Bount trailed off from tripping worried words clearly distraught, and before the captain could comfort the refined woman, or invite her inside, Lisa stepped forward offering a kind warm smile, the one saved for Nano, and responded, "It's okay, you're safe here," as she guided the woman inside with an arm over her shoulder. Ichigo shook his head with a rueful glance at the stars before following inside, knowing once more the games had changed as the Bount would be unable to create the Bitto, and Yoshino, if Ichigo had any say in the matter, would not die. Zanjitsu humming reassurance and amusement, Ichigo closed the door to the night and followed Lisa into the warmth of the Shoten. X. Chapter 62, Alpus. X. Yoshino settled uncomfortably in the seat the female Shinigami had guided her to with a kind smile and wary eyes like hardened steel tempered 100 times over. Yoshino wasn't surprised that the Shinigami all regarded her with wary caution as if any moment expecting an invisible switch to flip and for her attack, but a few hours before she had been their enemy in nearly every way and now she was in their base of operations proclaiming her own traitorous nature. It was almost a strange parody of the Shinigami who had allied with the Bount. Or at least it all sounded so vaguely noble in her mind, but under the weight of the stares, some accusing, others trying to understand, the woman, who had long ago outgrown embarrassment, wanted to shrink back unto herself. The orange-haired Shinigami stood half in front of her, posture stiff and some form of confident as he challenged his comrades with his position alone, daring action or words. The female Shinigami at Yoshino's side did not hold the same defiance as the Shinigami with the eye-catching hair, but there was an understanding slope to her shoulders that reassured Yoshino slightly that fleeing to the offer of sanctuary wasn't all a lost hope. She had thought before the Shinigami had arrived, that she could deal with Kariya herself. She was close to him, and had been training for years on end with Gerda to achieve a fusion. But those thoughts had all been shattered and reformed into something half resembling a plan when the man in front of her had offered a chance at survival, eyes bright and promising. As much as living near endless years wore one down like thin sheets of tissue paper, Yoshino wanted to live, more importantly, wanted to live without the weight of revenge and hatred hanging off her shoulders. She wanted to see the next day, the new inventions of the future, tomorrow. The orange-haired Shinigami had offered it, eyes more promising than that of the many she had met in her life on the earth, restlessly seeking some meaning to her existence. But it was beyond the promise and strength of the Shinigami that had convinced her to turn away from Kariya, from the man she had once loved as true as night falls. It had been the years of sorrow and grief, there for all the world to see, but scabbed over with new experiences, new meaning, and an ancientness that perhaps did not speak of mortal years but wisdom all the same. It had been those eyes, ones that reminded her of her own years of living and sparked a shred of empathy for the man who she barely knew but for what the windows opened to all told. That and what Kariya had done when they had all returned from the altercation at the high school. He had raged and frothed about plans being disrupted. All the known Quincy that resided in Karakura were no longer an easy target to outnumber or to persuade in any matter. Then the man had turned those eyes on Yoshino, seeing beyond her, and beyond reason with the same egotistical need for vengeance that had frightened her thoughts into betrayal in the first place. Some of the others had been equally unsure. The Shinigami who had deserted had been quiet in contemplation and Gokoga had brooded in one corner while the others talked and plotted, about how they would capture a Quincy, and whether to do it all by force. During it all, Kariya's eyes had continued to stray to Yoshino, glowing with unholy light and malevolent ideas. Shivering, Yoshino tugged her attention forcefully to the moment at hand and watched as the orange-haired Shinigami placated the others. His words were both commanding and sincere as he spoke of the near genocide of her race with understanding, and how he had sworn to her safety and would fight the others if they were so inclined to challenge him. The bald one looked particularly eager to do so, on principle of a fight alone. The female Shinigami leaned close to Yoshino while still maintaining a respectful distance and whispered quietly, "We won't change our minds so easily. When Ichigo offered you sanctuary he meant it, and if there's one thing the orange-haired brat doesn't do is go back on his word." Yoshino nodded at the kind words bitten with familiar and fond vitriol at the orange-haired Shinigami Ichigo and smiled in thanks even as the door creaked open behind her with a shuffling alike to wind through the long grasses or the creeping age of wood played by the wind. Craning her neck around as the others' gazes drifted towards the door, Yoshino was greeted with the image of a man in something like a lab coat, blonde almost gold hair, and a stripped bucket hat shadowing cunning dagger-like eyes. The man, who was obviously a Shinigami of some nature, surveyed the room quickly and efficiently like a predator in a new environment before his eyes landed on Yoshino. For one terrifying moment those eyes were like dark voids of interest, curiosity, thoughts running through them with a calculating hard edge before it was gone, and the man smiled disarmingly and ambled into the room with a happy gait. "Now Ichi, picking up another stray I see?" The man in the striped hat asked with a coy smile that turned his expression into something teasing, as the orange-haired Shinigami spluttered for a moment before he scowled at the man with striped hat and resolutely said nothing with his arms petulantly crossed over his chest. Chuckling to himself, the man turned to face Yoshino and with a bow sweeping his hat off his head introduced himself. "Hello, my name is Kisuke Urahara, I own this shop, the Urahara Shoten, and if you would like I can provide you with sanctuary for as long as needed. Though I warn you I do not take freeloaders lightly." The Gale man had flipped from one moment to the next, taking on a serious persona, eyes twinkling with intrigue and promise as he studied Yoshino with a gimlet eye. In the background, a red-haired Shinigami with tattoos complained loudly about freeloaders, and a small Shinigami, the one with the ice Zanpakuto, bashed the red-headed male over the head. Yoshino studied the man for a moment before she let her gaze drift past the Shinigami and to Ichigo watching the scene with careful eyes, and to the other Shinigami, all watching with a sort of unhostile neutrality that did little to soothe Yoshino's heart, but rested some worry still lingering. She considered it the idea of working for the man and staying in the candy shop which housed this base for Shinigami in the back. It was safe, the man in front of her exuding the type of power that wasn't dependent on Reisu alone, and with the constant flow of Shinigami Kariya wouldn't dare to attack the building. Furthermore, once it was all over she could leave, but for now, she was safe. Pulling her coat tighter about her arms in a measure of security, Yoshino caught the dagger-like eyes of the man in front of her and with a nod responded, "I would be honored if you would allow me to stay here." Once more the man teetered from one mood to the next as he grinned and clapped his hands as if a child with a new toy, which was a mildly disturbing thought. The orange-haired Shinigami behind the man with the striped hat slumped with a sigh of relief at her acquiescence to staying, even as another Shinigami, one with short blonde hair and a bob cut and an aura of age that few in the room possessed, called out, "Now hold all your horses. How do we know you're not some spy meant to infiltrate our base and slither through our plans like a sneak?" Yoshino cringed at the question, knowing it was beyond valid considering her desertion was a multitude of reasons of which few she could share. All eyes in the room swung first to the blonde who studied her with beady eyes, before swinging to Yoshino in obvious contemplation, as if attempting to see her role as the suspicious blonde had painted it. A silver-haired Shinigami with eyes like slits studied her with a quiet knowing intensity before he commented with a bit of a grin to his voice, "She ain't ta type." Yoshino wasn't sure whether to thank the silver-haired man or scowl at him for the insult to her skills at deception, but decided on nodding her gratitude even as the woman sitting beside the man swatted his shoulder with a bit of a scowl. Ichigo tensed near imperceptibly, expression twisted into something thoughtful and yet remarkably placid before he said, "How about we listen to what she has to say?" The orange-haired Shinigami's words silenced the others, whose rising whispers had begun to border on a cacophony. With a quiet, almost shamed looks their eyes settled on her. Yoshino took a deep breath and drew on the strength ground into the marrow of her soul after an eternity of living among humans. She would convince the Shinigami of her innocence, she had to. Going back to Kariya was not an option, not if she wanted to live. Kariya, he was once inspiring, whole in a way he isn't now. I never agreed with his way of consuming souls for power, not when we can live without it. But I had loved him then in a way that has grown sour now. He wants to consume too many souls in his lust for vengeance, and I'm afraid of what else he might do in the face of that. I want to live, as much as my existence has been long on this earth I want to continue to watch it grow." Silence followed her words, but it was the kind of contemplative silence where the audience pondered the words and attempted to come to a decision. It left nerves fluttering about her belly as she picked at the frayed cloth of one of her sleeves. The female Shinigami beside her, the one who seemed understanding and caring beneath a cool exterior, smiled in an encouraging manner as the orange-haired Shinigami took a step closer to her in insinuation of where his loyalties would lie in this matter. The Shinigami with the short blonde hair shook his head with a grin that was far too wide to be anything other than predatory, laughed and commented, "Well, that's that then." Yoshino's shoulders tensed at the words, unknowing of their context, before the man directed the carnivorous Jin at her and continued, "Ya ain't lying, Jin woulda called ya on it had ya been. And Ichi here with his savior complex ain't gonna let us do anything dramatic, so welcome to the Urahara Shoten." Yoshino swallowed her relief at the acceptance of the group of Shinigami. Some were still regarding her with suspicious eyes, but most of them had accepted the words of the short-haired Shinigami easily. "Ichigo, why don't you guide our guest to one of the new rooms? We still have a briefing to finish," much to the joy of the others gathered. The man with the stripped bucket hat commanded, or rather asked in a disguising nice sing-song tone, of the orange-haired Shinigami, who startled at the words drifting from whatever space his mind had occupied. The orange-haired Shinigami's gaze landed on the man with the striped hat and he nodded once in agreement before levering to his feet with a graceful motion. Yoshino nodded her head once more in thanks to the man who had provided such hospitality, and with a last nod in farewell to the other Shinigami followed the orange-haired man out of the warmth of the small living room. The hallway was almost graciously still compared to the constant energy of the living room. Yoshino breathed slightly at ease now that she was out of the eyes of the Shinigami as she stepped into the small space. The moment the rickety door rattled closed behind her and sealed away the other Shinigami, Ichigo turned to face her, eyes smoldering with a fierceness like a burning star as he studied Yoshino. After a second, his shoulders slumped and the expression faded away to be replaced by one that reflected a deep exhaustion that was more than bone deep before that too was gone. An almost silent conversation drifted between the lone occupants of the hallway, one where Ichigo asked her to be respectful, to try and live with the man with the striped hat, accompanied by a good dose of apologies and promises to try and save what bound he could. In response to the honest, almost strangely naive in their intensity unspoken words, Yoshino allowed her eyes to reflect acceptance and the same sort of determination and promise. Nodding to himself, Ichigo turned and began to walk through the hallways at a semi-sedate pace, one that allowed Yoshino to catch up to the man's longer strides and listened as he commented, "Kisuke is a good man, a scientist at heart, but with ethics and morals buried somewhere underneath it all. Even if you can't find a place, the Shoten is always open. Though Shinigami don't have the same concept of time as your kind, we've still lived many years more than that of the average human." Ichigo informed her kindly, with a fondness to his tone that betrayed his intimacy with the man even as he paused in front of a plain door orientated with a myriad of colorful stickers, and other bright things. The orange-haired Shinigami leaned casually against the doorway as Yoshino cautiously slid the door open, and commented, "We'll likely start the final assault within the next few days. If you need to say any goodbyes, I recommend you do so discreetly and inform one of us so we can accompany you. If you ever need anything, I'm happy to help. Good night." The orange-haired Shinigami finished with a nod and a smile that sent Yoshino's emotions scuttering about inside her head. It wasn't that the smile was attractive, though it was, but more the genuine emotion behind it, and a sense of something more behind it. A promise, to aid, to help, that lingered and resounded as truly as any of the old gods. Yoshino nodded in gratitude, thoughts briefly drifting to Kariya, wondering if she should attempt to say goodbye to the man she had once loved, or if there were any of the Bount she needed to see before they might never meet again. Ichigo smiled once more before he turned away and strode back towards the living room, his figure cutting into the shadows before merging with them and leaving only the empty quiet of her thoughts. For a moment, Yoshino turned to face the guest room she had been offered. It was small but airy and with a simple theme much like one might see in a human hotel, though with touches of a historical feel. The room, as lovely in its plainness as it was, lingered with the silence, and Yoshino, wary of this new unfound situation, glanced towards where the orange-haired Shinigami had come from and made a decision. Creeping back along the hallways, one hand sliding along the cool wall, Yoshino once more came upon the living space, the simple shoji door guarding the entryway closed but doing little to block the sound of voices escaping the room. Yoshino paused beside the doorway and quietly listened as the voices spoke. "We need to attack soon. If this keeps going on, they could try to attack one of the Quincy with force." One voice commented, deep and male with a sensible tone, one that was more familiar than the others and likely Ichigo. Another voice soon joined the first and added, not to mention the potential to harm the souls of Karakura town. The second voice was female, deep, and crisp and concluding excellently on what some of Kariya's future plans had entailed. Yoshino frowned, thoughts drifting to plans that had too high a cost, demanding more than Yoshino was comfortable with, even with her own apathy of the matter, the lust for vengeance long gone cold in the face of time. Someone needs to stay behind when we attack in case one of the bound slips out of our net. Another voice commented, likely the man with the stripped hat, as a general consensus of agreement followed the sound logic. A second later another male voice spoke, it's best if you stay behind Urahara-san, and it is likely Aizen Teiko will be visiting the mortal world to aid you in securing the bound. The kids got it right, everything should be fine with us going and leaving the situation to those kooks. Another voice interjected with a low rasping drawl dripping with amusement and teasing as the sound of someone spluttering in offense reached Yoshino's ears. Before the person who had likely been insulted could defend themselves, another voice spoke up, all right everyone listen up, we know that there will be 9 in the mansion including the deserter. I'll deal with Kariya and the one with the metal doll, Renji, and Ikeku deal with the old bound, he has a huge doll. Jin deal with the creepy one with the glasses, watch out for the deck of cards. Rukia please deal with the water twins, and if you need to you can bring in the 3 Quincy from earlier to assist you, but remember that you risk putting their lives in danger if you do so. Lisa, Rangiku take on the bound with the fan and the one with the orange hair, watch out he has a means of possession. Shinji deal with the deserter, see if you can convince him of Soul Society's innocence, if Renji or Ikeku are finished with their battle take them with you. The voice, which Yoshino identified as the orange-haired Shinigami, finished, to the silence and rapt attention of the room before him. Yoshino held her breath for a moment even as her eyes crinkled in thought, and she wondered how the man, one who had hardly met all of the bound, knew so much about them and their powers. It wasn't simply reconnaissance, there was something in his voice that spoke of a deeper knowledge or understanding. A chorus of agreement followed the commands, accompanied by good-natured mumbling, and a bit of ribbing. Yoshino muffled laughter into the palm of her hand at the nature of the Shinigami and turned away, feeling the exhaustion of the night's events begin to drag at her eyelids and steps. The days to come would be different and likely difficult, but Yoshino wanted to survive, wanted to see what new things the Shinigami would do, see how they had changed from the once bloodthirsty killers they were once heralded as. Walking down the hallway, Yoshino's shoulders felt invisibly lighter while at the same time heavy with the weight of her resolution to the future. Ichigo ducked under the swing of a Zanpakuto, one that vibrated through the air like a piano wire as it sliced above his head at a wicked angle. The orange-haired Shinigami pivoted on his feet and let Zanjutsu slam upwards to catch the other blade arcing towards his neck, crackling with electricity in an untampered maelstrom that sent shivers trespassing through Ichigo's spine. Winds blew about the mansion, crashing and billowing through shattered windows and tearing at his shiakusho with vicious abandon as Ichigo ducked under another overhead swing from Kariya, eyes alight like a madman, and launched a kick towards the man's torso before whipping around to catch Ichino's Zanpakuto on the broad edge of Zanjutsu's blade. As the young captain reversed his blade in a quick motion that slid the other Shinigami's Zanpakuto away from his torso and flicked it towards the deserter's neck, Ichigo wondered how everything had come to this point. Oh, the plan had all started normally enough, or as normal as one could find when it came to the Shinigami in any situation. The likelihood of a plan succeeding perfectly, however, slim had started out well. They had entered the mansion, sans twins to Ichigo's immense relief, though he knew they were likely patrolling the streets, and that Rukia was actually with them considering one of the Mod Soul's warnings about the twin bounce in Karakura. Then in a chaotic typical fashion everyone had gotten caught up in one battle after another, separating and fleeing to different parts of the mansion, as to be expected none of it was to his planning. He wasn't worried, for the most part, he knew the competence of his comrades, in many cases intimately. But just because they held more power than the bound didn't exclude the fact that they could still be defeated just as easily as they could win depending on the matched powers and skill sets. One could be a master with a fan, but when facing a sword some of that was negated depending on the tactician or the skill set of one's opponent. It was the same in any battle, Ichigo acknowledged as he swirled away from a storm of lightning striking the ground with deadly intent, sending rubble and dust into the air with a wicked vengeance. Ichigo had only a moment to tense in preparation as he watched Ichino's step a half pace away and with eyes drenched in familiar battle state revealed his Shikai in a surge of light that was near blinding and accompanied by a waterfall of Reisu. Ichigo squinted at the bright light, briefly contemplating keeping his eyes open for the remainder of the fight before allowing them to slide close with a tug of Zanjutsu's Reisu. Ichino's Zanpakuto was one of light and perception, however, in the same manner of some other illusion-type Zanpakuto, if your mind was strong enough and you relied on other senses one could negate some of the effects. Letting Zanjutsu switch to his left hand, Ichigo raised the blade and easily deflected against the barrage of shadows that spun towards him even as the smell of ozone in the atmosphere increased in preparation. Darting forward with a swift burst of Shunpo, Ichigo ignored the lightning striking behind him, and the gusts of wind that began to warp like the shadows and strike at him and let Zanjutsu fold towards Ichino's torso. The deserter caught the heavy weight of Zanjutsu on his own blade of light, surprise, and a myriad of other tangled emotions emanating from the blade as Ichigo was pushed off and sent back a half pace before being submitted to another onslaught from both sides. Ducking and dodging in rapid motion as Kiriya's increasingly sloppy but heavy strikes countered Ichino's darting lightning-fast attacks, Ichigo briefly spared a thought to wonder how the others were doing, wondering if Gokoga had survived the battle with Ichigo, and at the same moment cursing and wondering where Shinji had run off to, or perhaps one of the members, or former, of the 11th Division. As his opponent's attacks increased in intensity, many tornadoes collecting about the air and whipping lightning about as if it was confetti and the shadows bounced off of the illumination of the lightning and surged towards Ichigo, the orange-haired captain flashed away from the battle to stand a semi-safe distance away. He knew it was time to up the ante a slight bit. Channeling his Reisu to Shiro's sadistic amusement, Ichigo allowed the Reisu to well in his blade and with a great upheaval parted the form of his sealed blade into his dual Zanpakuto. Kiriya and Ichino aborted their movements to attack in a brief halting motion at the reveal of his dual Zanpakuto, the dark metal glinting strangely, almost glowing ethereally in the miasma of light and shadows that filled the room like something from a lava lamp, where space itself seemed confused. The surprised halt of action lasted only a moment before Reisu rippled and coiled like a great snake preparing for attack, and Ichigo watched with weary eyes, almost wishing for Asun's shades, as balls of light filled the air hovering like will-o'-the-wisps all ethereal and still before they surged towards him wicked fast. With a burst of Shunpo, Ichigo crossed the grand polished marble floors of the mansion, cracked and chipped like a bygone decade, Zanjutsu sure and singing in his hands as he attempted to avoid the attack chasing his heels. As he landed, the balls of light once more swarmed him and formed a cage of light around him, pressure building and increasing with the intent to crush him as the air continued to swell with ozone. Shaking his head for a moment to focus his concentration, Ichigo materialized Asun's glasses anyway and let his Reisu surge forth, consciously aware of how restricted he needed to be within the mortal world because of the seals. With Shiro crowing in his ears, Ichigo took another limited breath and pushed his Reisu against the barrier surrounding him with all the force of a tamed supernova. The shield of light resisted his efforts for a moment, straining in a way that highlighted the full color spectrum entrapped around him like an oil spill before with another surge of Reisu the light around him cracked like a mirror and fell apart, revealing the mansion looking half like ancient ruins due to the damage their battle had caused. Kiriya jerked from where he had been looming over the deserter, the last of his words spilling like echoes through the vast receiving hall. Ichigo let Zanjutsu swing through the air at his side in what he knew would be an intimidating move and let something slightly less than feral grace his lips as he regarded his opponents. Kiriya was still staring at him with crimson eyes, an unsettling mix of blank despondence and swirling madness, as Ichino stared agape that his trap had failed. With a snarl from the white-haired Bount, the clouds overhead rumbled and thundered, light beginning to appear through the shattered windows as Kiriya took a slow sinuous step forward that was both tipsy on madness and lethal with fury at the same moment. As Ichino slipped to his feet, and Kiriya raised the blade form of his doll, the doors hanging onto their hinges through sheer luck slammed open and Renji strode inside accompanied by Shinji, who was covered with a dubious amount of blood, and eyes like liquid gold alight with glee in his hollow powers. "Ah, and ya chide me for making a mess, Ichi." His friend chortled, voice raspy in a telling double tone announcing their presences. Ichigo nodded in greeting to his friends as he kept his eye and mind on the battle in front of him. Kiriya was watching everything with cunning eyes, even as Ichino's had paused in his stalking to stare at Renji, who was engaging in a ferocious stare-off with the former 11th Division member. "You there, traitor?" Renji called out in clear challenge, voice echoing and yet a whisper under the roaring of the winds and sparks of lightning dancing through the air like sunlight. Ichigo shifted and Kariya, heedless of the entry of the two Shinigami, and Ichino's own internal struggle, surged forward, lightning collecting about his form and wind sending it sprawling so from afar he looked as if composed of lightning. Ichigo lifted Zanjutsu and let his Reisu coat the blades, seeping them in an unreleased Getsuga Tensho, as his Iero activated to its full potential, bleaching his skin to the color of bone. They collided with a surge of Reisu and lightning clashing against each other in a great wave that scorched the ceiling and the floor as they ensconced Kariya and Ichigo in ethereal light. They traded blows at a speed that would have been hard for others to comprehend or see. As they moved, the air wavered and the ground quaked. Back and forth they crossed a small space on the cracked floor, as Reisu and lightning continued to collide in great shows of light that were humbling to view. One part of Ichigo's mind was centered on his friends and the deserter safe behind a barrier as the two forces of nature continued to collide, the other was focused on surviving the battle. Landing a kick to Kariya's chest, Ichigo sent the man flying, crashing into the far wall with a shatter of rubble and a screech of air. Standing straight, Ichigo inhaled deeply, every line of his body coiled tight before he forced himself to relax, knowing that his senses were still more than alert enough. "Hey, Ichi needs some help," Shinji called out, practically yelling over the orchestra of noise their battle was creating, concern lining his voice where he was standing tense beyond the cracked barrier. Flaring his Reisu and shaking his head, Ichigo swiftly responded, "No. Deal with the deserter. Peacefully if possible." Before the orange-haired Shinigami could check to see if his friend had heard the command, Kariya was surging forward, skin glowing from within as he was swept up into merging with his doll, looking for all the world some divinity of lightning. Ichigo frowned as Zanjutsu struggled against the weight of Kariya's blade, the lightning veering towards his neck as the young captain felt the full twisted span of his opponent's scourged emotions. Just the same as Kariya felt Ichigo's determination, his broadcasting of faint hues of the future unheeded as the very air shrieked with madness and battle. The young captain wished the battle would end already. There was no need to prolong an already told ending, unless it could be changed, which Ichigo knew was unlikely but hoped for silently regardless. They collided once more, moments dragging out into eternity as Reisu and liquid electricity clashed like fireworks around them and lightning caught at Ichigo's skin, as much as his Reisu pulled at Kariya's lightning. Sliding across the floor, the two opponents faced one another, the small intermission in their fighting providing a moment of awareness to his own lack of breath, and the burn of his Reisu as Kariya panted like a wild animal across from him. This would be their final charge. With a roar of Reisu, the two opponents surged forward, Reisu humming through his veins. Ichigo ducked under Kariya's overhead swing and let Zanjutsu slice through Kariya's defense. Landing in the shards of glass as the winds died down and silence rang eerie and unnerving, Ichigo shifted and turned to face Kariya, ignoring the new wound tugging at his back. The leader of the bout was kneeling in shards of glass like shattered wings, uncaring as the drapes fluttered about him. Soundlessly Ichigo glided across the floor, Zanjutsu held tightly in his hands as he remained alert and tense, and the feel of blood dripping down his back filtered into his awareness. Kariya shifted as glass clicked and tinkled beneath Ichigo's feet, turning to face the orange-haired Shinigami with empty eyes that spoke of the void. His hands were folded over his chest, over the wound there leaking crimson, even as his blade laid shattered beside him, likely having suffused itself with all Kariya's power to cut through Ichigo's Iero. Shivering at the exhaustion dragging his every movement, Ichigo rolled his shoulders and walked the last few steps to stand in front of Kariya. "How?" The man questioned, voice garbled and breathless, drifting mournfully in the empty air of the mansion. Questioning how he had lost, how everything had reached such a point. Ichigo crouched to face the man, staring into the bounce crimson eyes with a restlessness that dragged at his thoughts, guiding his actions to different paths before swirling to one decision, to who he was at his core. Pressing his hands above Kariya's to help apply pressure in a light healing Kido, all he was capable of until his Reisu reserves restored themselves, he spoke, "Your race will live, they will not be forgotten to shadow, you could lead them to the future." Ichigo's own voice was like the rustle of air tooling fall leaves along the pavement as he spoke haltingly, sincerely in the timelessness of the moment that seemed to echo and rebound, threatening to fade. As much as part of him cautioned offering peace and the future to Kariya, another part of Ichigo relentlessly believed in what he saw in the man's eyes and how his own life had been shaped by mercy or lack of it. The leader of the bout glanced up, some of the madness draining away from his features along with the life force coating their fingers, thoughts spinning about with all the force of a whirlwind. Kariya studied Ichigo with a soul-bearing intensity before the powerful Bount glanced at the ground, letting the silence fill the atmosphere. "You've seen what's coming," Kariya stated, the words far more chilling than the aftershock of battle where they echoed and bounced throughout the receiving room. Ichigo broke eye contact with the Bount and glanced out of the remnants of the window and nodded, a frown dancing across his features. Verbally confirming it was something Ichigo was almost afraid of, as it tugged the truth of the inevitable closer. The leader of the Bount frowned at the silent answer. For once his expression was clear. There was no dawning understanding, no great revelation or empathy, just calculating confirmation. Ichigo applied a bit more healing Kido to the wound, as Zanjutsu Asen hummed throughout his mind, and the moment hung between them. Kariya shook his head after another moment of silence and said, "They'll unite under Yoshino and Gokoga if they're still alive. I've made too many mistakes, lived too long, seen too much." The leader of the Bount stared into Ichigo's eyes with unshakable resolution, looking weary and yet accepting at the same moment. He continued, "I think you already understand Shinigami." Ichigo's eyes widened at the bitterly true words, thoughts twisting over themselves as he tried to puzzle out and reason the words of the man dying in his arms. Kariya grinned. Once wicked and sharp, the young captain could understand a little bit why Yoshino had fallen in love with the man. Kariya took a deep, rattling, hopeless breath before his eyes recentered on Ichigo with something asking there among the fading light. Frowning in understanding, Ichigo reached over with one hand and grasped Zanjutsu Asen's small trench knife and allowed his Reisu to seep into the Bount's nerves, dulling his senses, a trick Konohana had taught him after a long night at the fourth. Softly Ichigo questioned, "Are you sure? You could help your race flourish?" Kariya nodded, eyes fortified steel where they stared into Ichigo's own, and said, "I can't guide them. Protect them." With a nod the young captain positioned his blade over the Bount's heart, hands shaking for a moment as his will wavered before solidifying. Taking a breath, Ichigo finished the act, all the while maintaining eye contact with Kariya as the light slowly faded and the man breathed out a sigh of relief before slumping lifeless in Ichigo's arms. Sliding Kariya's eyes closed, Ichigo sighed and gently rested the body on the ground, watching as it crumbled to dust in the fading hues of the night with mournful eyes. Standing, Ichigo sheathed Zanjutsu and let his Reisu, searching for the others, ascertaining their life, both Bount and Shinigami. With a sigh of relief, Ichigo ignored the burning of his eyes and the emotions welling in his chest and let his eyes drift to the sunlight piercing through shards glass like a kaleidoscope. The mess with the Bount was over. The ending had perhaps been far different from what he had expected, but in the end, once more, lives had been saved. X. Chapter 63, Oubliette. X. Kisuk hovered over his newest patient, studying the large man with critical eyes as he assessed the damage: a large incision to his torso, multiple shallow incisions, and exhaustion. He attempted to put together a method of healing for the Bount, for all the Bount in his care, with his rather limited knowledge of their biology. Glancing up as the pair of twins shifted on the bedding he had placed them on with shallow groans of pain, Kisuk ignored the frown threatening to pull at his features. Part of him wanted to curse Ichigo for placing him in this position, while another part of him was at least happy they had avoided the extinction of an entire race once more. Running a hand through his hair, the scientist rose somewhat gracefully to his feet and listened to Benahim's good-natured rumbling as he crouched beside the deserter, who was still unconscious, much like his opponent. The idiot redhead had informed Ichigo that he had convinced the deserter of Soul Society's innocence, or something of the sort, through battle before falling unconscious. The man, Itchy Nose, had a few large incisions from Zabumaru, and incisions that would be difficult to heal due to Aburai's serrated shikai. Allowing his hands to hover over the largest of the wounds, Kisuk pulled on his reserves of Reisu and the familiar humming green glow of healing Kido and shrouded his hands. If there had been one benefit of returning to Soul Society during the course of the manicured war against the Espada, it had been Anohana forcing him into the fourth to refine his healing, however scary it was. The door to what Kisuk privately thought of as the med bay, considering how many injured souls he had withheld within its bounds, slid open with a familiar rattle and revealed the female Bount who had fled her comrades. In her arms, she held a small bucket, some gauze, and a determined look plastered across her features. The blonde scientist smiled in greeting and beckoned Yoshino inside with a tilt of his head as he continued to heal the deserter with a steady flow of Reisu. Yoshino stepped inside the room with sinuous grace, all perfected elegance subdued by the silence of the room and the severity of the past few days. She studied Kisuk for a few moments as if questioning his actions before she demurred her head and asked in a quiet whisper, who would you like me to bandage first? Start with your comrade with the fan, please. Don't worry about the larger wounds, I'll handle those. Kisuk replied kindly, ignoring whispering thoughts of teasing and questioning, even as his eyes strayed to the Bount and 1,000 curiosities tickled at his mind. How long had some of them been alive? Was it a product of the soul combining with flesh? Were their bodies sustained through Resu, or had their consumption of souls impacted the matter of their body? Shaking away the thoughts with a self-depreciating smile, Kisuk watched as the female Bount crouched beside her comrade and began washing and bandaging the wounds with a practiced care that once more forced his curiosity to the surface. Turning away with a little shake of his head, the blonde scientist studied the deserter and the largest of wounds, most of which were healed into angry red scars. The man would live, and Kisuk could refrain from spending all of his energy on one of the injured. Shuffling to his feet, the blonde surveyed the room and silently wished Tessai was there to aid in healing, or just listen to him blabber on about what new discovery he had made, or what invention the Shinigami absolutely needed because they were so incompetent. At the same moment, he also wished for tea. He would be fine with any brew really, even his. It had been a long few days, not as much for Kisuk, who had mostly stayed out of the way of battle, except for his brief skirmish when the old Bount had decided to attack the Kurosaki household while the others attacked the school, but in hosting the Shinigami and dealing with the fallout of the battles. Though Kisuk acknowledged with a half-smile, he didn't have the right to complain when it came to his duties in comparison to Ichigo, who was still doing damage control last the scientist had seen. The orange-haired Shinigami had arrived with the others sometime around dawn, the twins having arrived with Rukia and 2 more injured Bount before that, and then leaving to Kisuk's immense relief. The orange-haired captain had the deserter and the large male Bount slung over his shoulder, and he had been injured as well, the idiot without self-preservation. Shinji had followed behind with a limp, Renji slung over his shoulder, as Lisa, holding another Bount, at his side scowled at a heavily injured but somehow still walking Ikeku. Rangiku and Jin had appeared a near hour later, looking a bit roughed up but overall in good health. Kisuk had offered to heal the others and the Bount, but Ichigo, the stubborn asshole, had fixed Kisuk with a firm look of defiance that set Kisuk's spirit sinking in understanding, and told the scientist to take care of the Bount. They had all filed into the Shoten like some strange blood-stained parade, and Kisuk had privately studied his friend. Ichigo, for all his presenting as a strong iron-born individual, was vulnerable, and Kisuk had seen it in those expressive eyes. Kyan would likely yell at him for allowing his brother to be hurt emotionally, and physically, once more, but Kisuk was more concerned with Ichigo's general well-being. They all didn't want a repeat of the first incident, so he had pulled Shinji aside and all but threatened him into taking care of the orange-haired idiot before he had marched into the med bay to deal with his new patients. Benihime grumbled in his mind about focusing on patients and not reminiscing, which Kisuk accepted with a demure smile. His Zanpakuto at least was happy that they had seen battle once more and tasted blood. As Kisuk crouched by Yoshino to take care of the female Bount with the weaponized fans, very interesting aerodynamics, he wondered how they worked, though they probably used air currents within. Kisuk began the healing Kido and resolutely ignored the thoughts of aerodynamics and the Bounce dolls in general. Instead, as he concentrated on the Kido finding all the major critically wounded areas, Kisuk wondered what new faction would rise to challenge Soul Society next. And he knew there would be another one. Ichigo may have hinted at it briefly during the war, but it was there in his eyes, along with 1,000 other things that Kisuk wanted to dissect as much as he wanted to vanish. The only question was how many. Already he had heard word of the Danga acting strangely, and that was to exclude word of trouble within the noble houses which Kairo Raku had complained of when they had all gathered for dinner. Kisuk sighed and shrugged, drawing a strange look from Yoshino, who was still bandaging the wounds with abject care. They would deal with it when it occurred, and in the meantime, Kisuk would make 1,001 counter-plans. The sound of footsteps in a low drawl breached Kisuk's thoughts as he startled from where he was almost finished healing the woman as best as possible with his limited medical knowledge of the Bount, as he glanced towards the door where a familiar silhouette stood. After a second of more low conversation, the door slid open and Kisuk was greeted with the sight of Shinji slouched casually against the frame with all the sinewy grace of a predator. The wizard looked far better than he had earlier in the morning, where every line of his features had been drenched in exhaustion and fading bloodlust. Jin was standing beside the blonde captain, studying the injured Bount with a curious aura before his intensity swung to Kisuk, making the scientist almost want to cringe as much as to stare back in challenge. Ichi's finally asleep. Insisted on healing us all, then his own wounds, the idiot. Lisa and Rangiku are making sure he won't get up till he needs to. I know the Demkid has reserves the size of the moon, but you think he would be less of an idiot for all of his supposed genius when it comes to waiting for reserves to actually replenish? Shinji stated in lieu of greeting, with a tick of annoyance and fondness blended across his features. Kisuke rolled his eyes good-naturedly at the man's words and his answered question of Ichigo's state. The information that Ichigo had finally passed out was completely unsurprising of the idiot who lacked any sense of self-care or preservation when it came to his comrades. Nodding his head in thanks to the blonde Kisuke, he paused for a moment to glance down at the female Bount. Ascertaining her state was survivable, he rose to his feet and shuffled towards the door. "Anything we can help with?" the blonde captain asked honestly, eyes holding exhaustion like a child to a stuffed toy but still insistent on offering help regardless. The blonde scientist shook his head, resting his hand on the blonde's shoulder. He replied with fondness, softening his voice, "No, go get some sleep. Jin, please make sure Hirako Teiko actually sleeps." Kisuke directed the last part at the lieutenant standing solid and silent as a statue at Shinji's side. Kisuke wondered if the youth had come just to make sure the blonde captain didn't tip over on the way. Jin nodded even as Shinji pouted but relented with a nod. Letting a mischievous grin slip onto his features, in a cheerful crow, Kisuke added, "Now off you go. Sleep. You're already dead after all." Shinji rolled his eyes but turned from Kisuke with a low raspy chuckle that sent interesting shivers down Kisuke's spine and ambled down the hallway. Jin bowed once to Kisuke before he followed the blonde captain. Slumping slightly as the two Shinigami disappeared, Kisuke dragged a hand through his hair, displacing his hat before he returned his attention to the med room and made his way to Gokoga to deal with the large man's wounds. The blonde scientist once more lost himself in healing the Bount before him, thoughts drifting idly to Soul Society, wondering how they were faring with the recovery efforts, if their ties with Hueco Mundo had eroded so easily already, how they had reacted to the Bount in the first place. Another part of the scientist contemplated what Ichigo had revealed about the Quincy, their numbers, and a little of forgotten history, but more importantly their weakness to Hollow Reisu. That was why the orange-haired captain had secured Hueco Mundo as a stable power base capable of their own defense in the first place. If Soul Society and Hueco Mundo both valued their freedom and basically living, then they would fight together against the Quincy and provide a tactical advantage over those who had lived in the shadows. Kisuke wondered furtively what else the youth was planning. What little he was willing to speak of the past was undetailed and vague. Sosuke and Kisuke had managed to get the youth mostly drunk one night, a true effort involving Sosuke spiking the drinks for good measure. Ichigo had spoken of the Quincy King with eyes more haunted than anything they had seen before. It made Kisuke wonder how the orange-haired Shinigami would fare when he undoubtedly faced the man once more. As if thoughts of Quincy and Ichigo had dragged some new presences near, the sounds of running breached the calm stillness of the med bay as two silhouettes ran past and a third followed at a slower pace. Before Kisuke could return to his work heedless of the interruption, the three shadows returned, crowding around the doorway with whispers and laughter that bounced and popped. "Girls. Is that you? Or has one of my experiments escaped again?" the owner of the Shoten called in a knowing and exasperated tone as the shadows hidden by the thin rice paper door stilled for a moment as one caught in the act might. The door once again slid open with a rattle and click, revealing Yuzo with a timid expression decorating her gentle features, Karin unimpressed with her arms crossed over her chest, and Rukia rolling her eyes behind the twins, features bright in a way that the normally stoic Kukaki rarely revealed. "Hi Urahara-san," Yuzo greeted at the same time as Karin inclined her head and said, "Hat and clogs." Kisuke swept his lovely stripped hat off his head with a welcoming and wide grin before he settled it once more in its rightful place atop his head and sent the three youths a questioning glance. Yuzo blushed in the manner Kisuke was coming to expect as typical, whilst Karin, in an excellent impression of an angsty teenager Kisuke had had the pleasure of meeting, rolled her eyes. "Can we train in the basement?" Yuzo questioned with a gentle grin, the kind that the scientist quickly concluded was the one in which you agreed to whatever was asked or face the terrible guilt of the younger twins' puppy eyes. Karin scowled at the question, even as behind the twins Rukia leveled the blonde scientist with a demanding, or maybe expectant gaze tinged with something asking. Chuckling to himself, Kisuke nodded and cautioned with a cheery whistle, "Just don't destroy anything too much. All my landscapers have suddenly quit and it would be a shame if certain freeloaders had to remodel the basement. Oh, and don't be too loud, injured people are trying to sleep." Rukia blanched at the barb as the twins nodded, and with a grin, Kisuk continued, "Now off you go, training to do, basements to destroy." Yuzo giggled and Kisuk resisted the urge to smile at the youngest Kurosaki in fondness as she bowed in gratitude. Karen was also endearing as she fixed Kisuk with a stiff nod, eyes alight with hidden humor. The twins turned away from the med bay and began walking down the hallway, leaving Rukia to signal her thanks with a half smile and eyes promising to look after the twins before she slid the rickety door shut with a click. Kisuk glanced down at the man he was healing and wryly commented, "Not much of a med bay with all the visitors, eh? Not like you'd notice." At his sharp comment, Yoshino let out a laugh muffled into the palm of her hand, eyes sparkling with mirth where she was tending one of the water twins. Kisuk flashed the young woman a grin, and after sparing a moment for a quick diagnostic of the bout in front of him rose to his feet. He ignored the cracks and pops of his joints and Benahim's laughter and marched over to the elegant female. Squatting beside Yoshino, the blonde scientist assessed the state of the twin bounce in front of him, frowning as he noticed that while his healing was working, it wasn't to the degrees he expected. It was likely something to do with their soul or body composition. "Urahara-san, will the bout really be safe here, from Soul Society?" Yoshino questioned softly, voice heavy with concern and a lingering fear that seemed to draw her features into stark relief. Kisuk sighed at the question, almost wishing for a moment that Ichigo was there to act as a knight in shining armor to reassure the young woman that everything would be okay. Instead, he tugged his hat off to run a hand through his tangled blonde hair and responded, "Soul Society hasn't been bloodthirsty killers in a while, not since Ichigo arrived, I would say." "Arrived?" Yoshino questioned with a curious tilt to her head, eyes still holding lingering fear and concern though it was temporarily held at bay as calculating steel picked at his words and their meaning. Chuckling in good humor, Kisuk resetted his hat on his head and letting it shade his eyes thought briefly about his response to the question before he replied, "Yes, arrived, in a great big storm too, winds blowing, Reisu everywhere. It was a good thing Kai and Shiba found him. Ichigo was a right mess back then, but you didn't hear me say that. Now well." Kisuk continued to babble as he monitored the states of the bout before him, content to gossip with mostly useless information than anyone who had been in the Godi I-13 could figure out. Yoshino sat quietly the whole time, interrupting only to clarify, such as whether the rumors of a certain locked closet at the academy were actually true, before letting him continue. As the scientist talked, he saw some of the deep-seated fears and anxiety hounding the woman clear, simple conversations, doing wonders for her nerves, and Kisuk's as well if he was being honest. As the former captain trailed off speaking of the Shinigami Women's Association latest glorifying war material, a comfortable contemplative silence settled between the two occupants of the room. Letting his gaze slide to the woman who continued to check the wounds of the bout in front of her, Kisuk decided he would be happy to have her at the Shoten if she was willing. Yoshino was intelligent, willing to help in any manner, made excellent tea, and had an understanding of the world most young Shinigami and mortals didn't understand. Yoshino shifted once more as if sensing his gaze and pinned Kisuk with a serious glance, one that was equal parts vulnerable and the battle-worn soldier. She questioned, "The Quincy will attack Soul Society soon, Kariya spoke of it once. Will we be expected to fight?" The question was one that left intrigue pulling at Kisuk's thoughts. He wondered how the leader of the bout had heard of the approaching invasion. At the same time, the scientist wondered if that was part of the reason Ichigo was so insistent on dealing with the vengeance-seeking factions peacefully, or at least with an open mindset. He wondered if it was all an attempt to gain their favor and hopefully their hand in the coming battle, a grand game of chess where they were competing for the best pawns. But then this was Ichigo he was thinking about. Kisuk almost wanted to be vague about his answer, manipulate it a bit so it seemed that helping them was only the right thing to do. It was saving the world after all. But instead, his pesky moral compass appeared just long enough to decide that he was not going to do that. Instead, Kisuk shook his head and replied, "No. You all were given your freedom and it's yours to do with as you will. I will say that fighting them is a matter of universal survival, but whatever you do is your choice in the end." Yoshino glanced down at her hands at his words, thoughts cast into a deep ocean of pensiveness that Kisuk was not ready to brace. Silently the scientist shifted away from the young woman, leaving her to her thoughts, and instead meandered over to check on the deserter once more. As he ascertained the man's condition, one of his devices vibrated where it was tucked into the many folds of his sleeves. Kisuk had respectfully muted them all so as not to disturb the quiet of the med bay. Ignoring the device, knowing if it was truly dire then it would be another different device, the blonde scientist returned his attention to the patient in front of him. A near few minutes later the sound of low conversation and a familiar presence appeared, and Kisuk quietly said with a bite of ire, "For Kami's sake," as he glanced towards the doorway and remarked that it was supposed to be a med bay. A quiet, peaceful place of healing, and instead everyone was insisting on marching in to announce whatever new intention or action suited their fancy. Brushing his long swaying haori off, Kisuk rose to his feet and let his Reisu reach out in greeting as the door slid open with a quickly becoming irritating rattle. Sosuke stood in the doorway, appearance immaculate as always, an expression a touch disdainful and amused where it lingered on the door Kisuk had happily plastered with stickers when he had been introduced to their amazing existence. A woman in a lab coat with honey hair pulled into a bun and a kind face stood behind Sosuke, appearance calm and polite till her eyes landed on the many bounce scattered about the floor. "Sosuke, I see you brought a guest," Kisuk said in lieu of greeting, with the tip of his hat shadowing his eyes and a grin curved like a scythe. The other scientist nodded with an appeasing smile, the one that always irritated the blonde slightly for far too many reasons, and replied, "Indeed, this is Rantau, she created the Bount. Is that why you were in Soul Society?" The blonde scientist questioned in response with a tilt of his head and a calculating gleam to his eyes. He was vaguely familiar with Rantau and her existence but had never met the woman in person. At the beginning of the whole situation, Kisuk had expected Soul Society's favorite genius to make an appearance, if only for curiosity's sake, but had summarily concluded that the man obviously had some other task to prevent such a journey. Sosuke nodded and stepped into the room, the scientist following behind him at a demure pace as the elegant captain commented, "Yes, Ichigo assigned me the task, insisted it was very important as with most favors the man asks. Of course, it was much easier to find her when Soul Society isn't nearly so prejudiced or biased as it once was." Kisuk nodded at the comment and the hint of true emotion that shone through his occasional partner's voice when he spoke of the changes Ichigo had enacted upon Soul Society, whether through force of his general presence. Without Ichigo, Sosuke would probably have fallen far into the realms of a megalomaniac, and Soul Society would be a shell of what it could be. This many survived. The woman questioned, voice wispy like willows in the wind on a brittle evening. At the female voice, Yoshino rose from where she was crouched over one of her comrades and stepped forward to stand beside Kisuk and study the woman. Nodding his acceptance, the blonde scientist responded, "Yes, though my skills at healing them are minimal at best." Rantau fixed Kisuk with a calculating look, intense as any creator in matters of their work, before Yoshino glided forward, intersecting the woman's view of the blonde scientist to speak to her in hushed tones. Allowing the two to speak in private, Kisuk drifted forward to stand beside Sosuke, noting the man's curious gaze unhinged with a touch of that calculating madness that was usually kept under lock and key. "How much more do you think?" The sometimes megalomaniac questioned faintly, as if the words, if spoken too loudly, would be cemented in stone. Kisuk frowned, trying to ascertain what the man at his side was asking. How many more invaders? How many more things that had slipped under Soul Society's carefully maintained rug? How much more could Ichigo, and all of them, take? At Sosuke's inquiring glance, Kisuk shrugged closer to the brown-haired man and flashed him a half-cocky, half-ascertaining smile. Before their conversation could continue, Rantau stepped forward once more and kindly questioned with carefully laced cyanide, "May I heal the Bounce Urahara-san?" Kisuk, more than fond of his life, nodded, and the woman, after smiling in thanks in a way that seemed to make her soul radiate, turned and crouched over the prone form of the fan-wielding Bount. Sharing an amused look with Sosuke, one that seemed to demand where Ichigo found all these strange characters, Kisuk released a sigh of relief. As much as he was content to take care of the Bount, he was more than happy to allow the creator to handle their care. He would provide sanctuary if needed with ease, hell, even if they needed some artificial soul food he could probably whip that up. Interesting idea, save for later, he absently-mindedly noted. But it was a weight off his chest to not have their lives hanging over his head. A knock on the door once again disturbed the sound of silence and healing, the sound light and almost a whisper before the door slid open with only the hint of a rattle and clack. Ichigo was hovering behind the doorway, eyes still a bit hazy, posture swaying with exhaustion, and his usually pristine Shiakusho was still a mess. Kisuk scowled at his friend, and he knew Sosuke was mirroring the expression, the two of them like a pair of parents facing a child who had broken one too many rules. Ichigo blanched at the twin force of their ire before he weakly lifted his cell phone with a wave and an air of abashment and apology. Scrubbing a hand over his features with a roll of his eyes, Kisuke questioned, "I thought Rangiku and Lisa had glued you to the bed, Ichigo." The orange-haired captain tilted his head for a moment of confusion and to process the words before a small grin stole across his lips and he replied, "They fell asleep." "Of course they did, of their own violation as well, I suppose." Sosuke commented in a sarcastic dry tone and a knowing stare. Ichigo blinked at the thinly veiled accusation before color danced faintly across his cheeks and he shrugged in response and said, "Hello to you, to Sosuke." Before the two could argue the logic of actually getting sleep when it was needed, Kisuke took a half step forward and questioned, "Ichigo, why are you up and about running through the Shoten?" The orange-haired youth colored once more at the question and smiled a touch apologetically before he responded, "Byakuya was worrying, so I decided first to call him, but then I decided to just go to Soul Society already and soothe his fears there." Sosuke and Kisuke traded twin knowing looks because Ichigo had managed to sound incredibly like a teenager with a boyfriend and yet at the same time completely sane if a bit disoriented by exhaustion. Stepping forward so he could peer closely into Ichigo's ever-defiant eyes, Kisuke responded, "Your boyfriend has waited a week, he can wait one more day. If you think it's necessary, call him, but I doubt you could even open a Senkaimon right now. Call your boyfriend and go back to bed." Kisuke ignored Sosuke's amusement at his mini-lecture and instead focused on Ichigo, who blinked for a moment at Kisuke's words before he frowned, looking for all the world like a puppy told he would never get to play again. After a moment, a hint of clarity stole into Ichigo's eyes and he nodded with a resolute look of sadness that made both adults feel incredibly guilty and empathetic for the tired youth, who would always be a youth to them for all the age in his eyes. "Come on, Ichi, I'll walk you to where everyone else is bunking," Sosuke commented with a warmth to his voice and expression that few souls ever saw. The orange-haired youth glanced up at the words and studied the brown-haired scientist skeptically for a moment before he consented with a nod. Sosuke traded a brief look and a promise to return with tea before he escorted the young captain out of the room and down the hall, the last click of the door echoing a bit in the scientist's mind. Glancing back at the room where the Bount were lying unconscious and Rantau was healing the Bount while talking to Yoshino, Kisuke let a small barely noticeable smile slip onto his features as Benihim's Reisu wrapped about him with all the pressure of a viper but the warmth of a hearth. Even among the attacks and the coming future, they were still souls, still a crazy family at the end of it all. Yuzu idled slowly down the street with Karen walking mildly beside her. The pleasant afternoon breeze tangled about the trees and whistled through the streets, as a frown furrowed the young woman's brow for a moment as something nipped at her senses. Biting her lip, Yuzu wondered at the sense, like something was missing or forgotten, like an important test or due date for school that she couldn't recall for the life of her. Turning to glance at her twin, Yuzu caught Karen's own disgruntled expression, though for the ebony-haired twin that sort of expression was far more common. Karen glanced up, obviously sensing Yuzu's gaze, and flashed her sister a grin, one that was a delicate balance between fond and teasing as she bumped her shoulder into Yuzu's. "How do you think Ho and Ban are doing?" Karen questioned after a moment where her gaze had drifted towards the horizon for a second too long for Yuzu's comfort. The words, spoken with some of Karen's hidden compassion, jolted Yuzu from more worried musings and instead drew her attention to the two Bount who had survived only through the intervention of Urahara-san and the original creator of the Bounts. "Well, we did see them yesterday and they seemed happy." The blonde twin finished with a shrug, allowing her eyes to drift freely about the streets as she thought on the two twins. Karen and Yuzu had stopped the Bount attack on Karakura using their Quincy powers as their uncle Ichigo would likely have advised, and Urayu had all but pragmatically growled about. For a moment, Yuzu's thoughts slowed as she tried to puzzle over the strange gap in what logic and reason dictated and what her own memories of the battle insisted. They had only used their Quincy powers and Kido, and yet they had been able to defeat two Bount who held elemental powers. If they had released their Shikai, the younger twin knew without a doubt that the other twins wouldn't have stood a chance, but they hadn't, and yet her memories told her it was an easy battle. Feeling disturbed and restless, Yuzu glanced over to Karen, who seemed to be in a generally sour mood as she glared at the pavement with a heavy brow, before with a shake of her head the older twin glanced up and responded, "I guess it must be tough for them, living the way they have, not to mention adjusting to middle school." Karen finished with a knowing grin and half a breathy laugh lingering on her voice. Yuzo nodded, recalling the somewhat morose expressions of Ho and Ban when the twins had talked to the two after they finished school. There had also been a touch of genuine joy and hope among all the typical dread of school that had sent Yuzo's chest ablaze with warmth. With a resigned curve of her lips, Yuzo accepted that they had likely once more adopted more strays. If Karen was one to find friends among strays and hold on to them with all the blazing fierceness of a raging fire, then Yuzo was the consistent embers drawing all to her hearth so she could care and provide for them. Rubbing her fingers in an idle motion as once more her thoughts circulated to a strange disconnect, the younger twin glanced up when Karen flared her Reisu. Their home was within sight now, the Kurosaka clinic standing clean and welcoming amongst the familiar buildings of their neighborhood. Most days their father worked in the clinic with their mother, but sometimes Ishine would leave to take care of business, which Karen and Yuzu had quickly come to understand meant Shinigami business of some sort. Their mother also had days where she needed to take care of business, but they had long ago ascertained whose bloodlines ran where. It brought to her mind the conversation they had had with their mother a week before the Bount invasion. The whole living room had seemed to be draped in thick currents of dread and fear when their mother sat down and spoke of the Quincy, the blood war, and the future in a quick factual tone. Part of Yuzo was still deathly furious at what Soul Society and the Quincy had done to each other when it had been explained clearly. Another part of her was terrified of what the resurgence of the Quincy could mean for her family. Once more Karen nudged Yuzo with her Reisu, a knowing sympathetic glance was directed her way as the door slid open. They were both preoccupied with drifting thoughts. The skies, which had started in lovely clear shades of blue, had begun to cloud over as if reflecting their lingering moods. Reflexively as the door swung open, Yuzo ducked their father's flying kick and Karen socked their old man in the chest with easy nonchalance regardless of the man's whining. Ishine had only started doing it after a few years of martial arts lessons and hadn't stopped since, even when Karen used it as a vindictive way to express teenage angst and pent-up emotions. Their father went sailing back into the house to collide with a wall in a vague cry of pride or something of the sort as Masaki appeared to take care of her husband with a resigned smile. Yuzu and Karen shared a knowing look with each other, rolling their eyes at their father's goofy antics before they burst out laughing. A moment later, after they had towed off their shoes and all other manner of after-school routines, Yuzo padded into the kitchen where their mother was watching over the stove. A soft frown decorated her features, one that seemed to encapsulate the protectiveness of a mother in the laugh lines around her eyes, and around her faded smile. Masaki glanced up at Yuzo's entrance, letting her gaze drift briefly to whatever was cooking, likely tempura, if Yuzo was correct, before saying, "Don't worry about helping today, dear. I think your Uncle Ichigo might have stopped by when no one was looking and left something in your room." The blonde twin perked up at the mention of Ichigo, whose visits were infrequent and always quite interesting in one way or another. His last visit had been with the Bount on official Shinigami business, but he had been alone for the start of it. Once again Yuzo tilted her head in thought, vaguely recalling that Ishine had once mentioned that usually, Shinigami traveled in pairs or groups of some sort. Shaking away the lingering sense of discomfort, Yuzo nodded and darted over to plant a kiss on her mother's cheek before she glided into the living room to drag Karen upstairs. The older twin protested for a moment at being disturbed from finishing whatever she had been working on before she saw the look on Yuzo's features and slumped in acceptance. As soon as the door had closed with a quiet click, Yuzo's eyes darted around the room, her Reisu easily picking up on the sparse traces of Reisu their uncle left whenever he went anywhere. Masaki had once explained it as an overabundance of Reisu seeking to return to the earth or something of that nature. A white piece of paper was lying innocently on the desk at the far end of the room, illuminated by a faint beam of sunlight. It seemed to taunt the twins in the doorway with the knowledge it held. Yuzo shared a silent conversation in a look with Karen, one where they both agreed to investigate and agreed that something about the day was more than off. The paper was smooth in Yuzo's hands as she opened the letter, Karen peering over her shoulder in unhindered interest as the blonde twin smoothed out the paper. Inside the letter, in their uncle's familiarly jagged yet somehow elegant script, was a mess of words written almost in a frantic manner. "Karen, Yuzo, I wish I could deliver this message in person, but I will likely be compromised by what is happening in Soul Society. Do you remember Rukia? You likely don't, but she saved your lives and is a Shinigami, the younger sister of Byakuya. She is in grave danger within Soul Society, and no one, I repeat no one, remembers her. You can ask Kisuke, Yuki, anyone, and they'll be confused. But I know you'll believe and understand me, maybe even remember. She needs your help. I wish I could be there, and I'm sorry I'm involving you both in the first place when I never wanted you to be involved with Soul Society till it was utterly unavoidable, but I have an important lead I desperately need to follow. Good luck, and please stay safe so your mother doesn't castrate me. Yuzo jerked back in numb shock as she finished reading the letter and handed it to her sister so that Karen could absorb its startling contents at her own pace. Rukia, the name was like ripples upon a still lake ringing out and tugging at the water before fading too quickly. They had known this Shinigami, of that Yuzo was beyond certain. It was the only thing that made sense as to the strange gaps between memory and logic she had experienced throughout the day, that and the strangely discontented feeling bubbling in her chest like a woman's intuition. Karen let out a barrage of curses that had Yuzo glancing over undisturbed at their vulgarity and concern, as she finished reading the brief letter. Karen's eyes were like fierce storms as she plopped onto the bed beside Yuzo with a heavy frown, eyes sparkling like lightning in realization in much the same way as Yuzo. Whoever Rukia was, she had saved them, and they owed her the same debt regardless, whether she existed or not was simple truth based on their uncle's words. The orange-haired young man had long ago convinced them that he wasn't a man who lied easily or pulled jokes in any matter such as this. Do you remember her? The older twin questioned, softly, hesitantly, like a sword muffled by a sheath would save its sharpness, as Karen stared into the palm of her hands. Yuzo shook her head at the question and caught Karen's gaze before she made a gesture in the ebony-haired twin's direction implicating an expected response. Karen shifted uneasily on the bed for a moment before she leaned against Yuzo and shared, like vague flashes that could be but almost nothing concrete. Yuzo frowned at her twin's words as the disconcerting feeling inside her chest seemed to bubble up and the voice of their Zanpakuto hummed encouragement with all the warmth of a newborn star. Letting her hand catch Karen's, the blonde twin glanced into her sister's eyes with a bit of a watery grin, a shrug, and stated, "We still haven't been to Soul Society. Now's as good a time as any." The ebony-haired twin rolled her eyes at Yuzo's obvious bait, some of the cloud of malevolent sadness hanging over their heads dispersing at the light humor. For a moment conflict flickered across Karen's features. It was the same sort of conflict that dwelled in Yuzo's own head. They wanted to aid the Shinigami who they couldn't remember. Yet at the same time, the knowledge of what entering Soul Society could mean was as stark as crimson on the snow. They would reveal themselves to Soul Society, however slightly, and in consequence, risk endangering their family. They both inherently knew without a doubt that if they entered Soul Society and fought, it would be with the Shinigami half of their inheritance. Ichigo had once sat the two down, brow heavy, and eyes that were normally like a still lake hiding something submerged beneath its watery calm had erupted. The man who they considered a brother had spoken carefully of the dangers both the Shinigami and the Quincy provided to their existence because of their parentage. Ichigo's eyes had burned then in the same way Yuzo recognized in Karen and herself when they protected others. "Should we speak to Mom?" Yuzo questioned cautiously, knowing the matriarch of the Kurosaki household would be sensible in the situation, as opposed to their often overprotective father. Karen glanced over to Yuzo for a moment before she nodded, lips pursed with a general aura of determination. As one unit they rose from the bed and descended the stairs. They couldn't afford to waste time or wait for Ichigo to come back. Even if it was the easier thing to do, to push the burdens onto someone else's shoulders, that didn't make it right and they both knew it. Their mother was in the kitchen humming some cheery tune under breath and whirling about with a fluid grace that was near awe-inspiring as always. Masaka paused in her motions to turn and face her daughters, and in the next moment, her open and warm expression instantly shuddered to something hard and dangerous at the looks on their faces. Yuzo and Karen traded a small look, one that whispered about the fear of Kami their mother could bring forth with a single expression, and solidified their will. Yuzo took a half step forward along with an inhale and said, "One of our friends in Soul Society is in danger. Ichi and I sent a message asking for our help. We need to go to Soul Society." Masaki regarded the twins with a careful glance, one that was as piercing as the chill of night and just as breathless, before she held out an expectant hand, eyes shining in a way that had both twins readying to stand their ground as much as bow in thanks. Yuzo carefully handed over the letter as the silence in the kitchen coalesced and thickened to a nearly unbearable temperature as their mother read the letter. After another excruciating minute, Masaka Kurosaki glanced up, a furrow between her eyes, and studied her children. She caught both Karen's and Yuzo's eyes, testing them without words before nodding in a slow, careful manner. Yuzo traded a smile, a bit rough around the edges but still beaming, with her sister at their mother's permission, before a litany of gratitude was delivered to the Kurosaka matriarch. Their mother laughed and swept the twins into a tight hug, whispers and prayers of protection filling the small cozy space before she stepped back. Karen traded a determined nod with Yuzu, and with a last peck on their mother's cheek the twins darted from the house, knowing their mother would handle their father's likely over-exuberant reaction, and the thought of him marching into Seoul society to protect his daughters was a slightly likely and scary one. The Urahara Shoten appeared after a few minutes of running, still as dilapidated and shabby looking as ever, though with the careworn sense of home that always soothed Yuzu's senses. The twins snuck around to the back of the shop and entered through the more direct route, the one that didn't involve the perusal of aisles of candy all piled together in one great incarnate of temptation. Quiet lingered in the back of the shop when they entered, the sound of shuffling and maybe vague talking faintly audible above the general hum of mechanics that always filled the Shoten. Yuzu traded a careful glance with her sister, one where Karen pointedly insinuated who was better at Reisu sensing with a raised brow, and let her own senses reach out searching for the ever-elusive Urahara-san. Smiling passively at her twin, Yuzu led the way through the Shoten, waving briefly at the new employee who had previously been involved in the Bount conflict, before pausing at the room which led to the underground training area. Sharing another bemused look, one that asked why the man couldn't invest in elevators or even escalators, the twins began the long trek down the ladder to the broad cavern below. Urahara-san was in the enclosed and fortified space that served as his lab, machines hulking guardedly about the area like abstract pieces of art. The man was there in the middle of the chaos, completely at ease and likely reveling in it. Sensing their presences, the former Shinigami put down whatever increasingly explosive device he was working with and with a push on his wheeled chair spun out to meet the two. "Girls, what can I help you with?" The man with the striped bucket hat asked with a leering grin that wasn't so much leering as unusually deceiving. Karen frowned at the man even as Yuzu fidgeted, suddenly shy at the implications of what they were about to demand. With a huff, Karen stepped forward and said, "We need to go to Seoul Society," and handed Urahara-san Ichigo's letter. Intelligent gray eyes darkened and flashed like lightning in a storm as he read over the letter, those same eyes flickering to study the girls with carefully veiled curiosity and rapid-fire electrons. A minute later Kisuk handed the letter back to Karen, tipped his hat with a bit of muttering to himself, and led them out into the broad expanse of the training area. "Be very careful there, girls. Only let your Shinigami Reisu show through, say it's a product of always having spiritual Reisu in your family, or whatever else. You know your Yuaki, and Byakuya would likely help you as well. Stay safe, please." Urahara instructed, with all the worry and overbearing of a parent sending their child off on their first day of school. Karen and Yuzu dutifully nodded along to the instructions, taking them to heart, knowing the honesty and good intentions behind it all. For all the man was a scientist, he seemed to genuinely care beneath it all. At their comprehending expressions, Kisuk muttered once more to himself and resettled his hat on his head. With an elegant movement, the scientist unsheathed Benihime, the blade glinting in the artificial sunlight as it was thrust between the fabrics of the world. Idly Yuzu wondered if they would be able to do so with their own Zanpakuto. Familiar shoji doors glowed and fluttered into existence, sliding open with artful nobleness and beckoning the twins forward. Karen nodded briefly in gratitude to the man who had aided them with little questioning, and Yuzu bowed in thanks before following her sister through the danga. The sensation of traveling through the danga was strange. They had been told about it, of course, Ishine weaving one fantastic story after the next about running from the cleaner, the endless walls, and the metaphorical and physical light at the end of the tunnel. But even as Reisu solidified beneath their feet and they kept moving forward, both Yuzu and Karen silently agreed that their father's stories could never have prepared them even acutely for what it all was like. The faint pinprick of light at the end of the tunnel began to grow steadily larger as Karen and Yuzu raced towards it, and after a minute they could almost reach out and touch it. Sharing a small grin, one that was equal parts excitement and determination, the twins stepped out of the danga and into Seoul Society. X. Chapter 64. Anomiya. X. They had entered Siriti easily in hindsight, Karen supposed, as they hid in an alcove, one of the many inhabiting the white walls of the Godei 13, which was a maze in itself full of pockets and dead ends. They were waiting in the interim as still and quiet as mice but for the cat perched on Karen's shoulder, who would eat such mice, as alarms blared throughout the streets. Though, whether it was due to their presence was debatable as they eavesdropped on a pair of Shinigami gossiping with a clucky vengeance. Part of it could have been due to where they had landed when they arrived through the shoji doors, awestruck and amazed, which had been placed conveniently near one of the Shiba compounds within Rungokai. Another part of it was Yoriyuki appearing as a cat at the right moment without a lick of surprise on whiskered features, leaving both twins to suspect Hat and Clog's intervention, and finally meeting Kyokaku Shiba. The older sister of their uncle had taken one look at the two of them plus Cat and welcomed them inside with a wide warm grin that they had seen far too many times on their father's features, and occasionally rarely on their uncle's, and it was scary to realize that same smile sometimes was their own. The woman who had welcomed them into her home had looked almost surprisingly like their father, and in some ways like their uncle, sans the orange hair. The twins had shared a knowing look at that, wondering at their mother's side of the family and what they got from them, what remained. Their aunt, who Yoriyuki had confided was practically the head of the Shiba clan, with their other uncle Kyan having a physical disability and still working for the Shinigami and Ichigo's whole plethora of duties, had sat them down in a living room that was something out of a historical drama from the Edo period and offered them sake. After Yuzu had carefully and elegantly blustered in indignant denial, while Karen stoically glared in disapproval, Kyokaku had crowed with laughter, the deep hearty kind, before settling down with eyes like fire dancing upon the sky and a serious yet sly curve to her lips. What followed had been a whirlwind introduction to their youngest uncle, who felt more like a cousin for all of Ganju's appearance and mannerisms, and he rode a boar which was totally awesome in Karen's well-educated opinion on awesome things. Yuzu and the dimple-faced youth had gotten along terribly, which is to say perfectly, and Karen had comforted herself with listening to the two discuss and trade recipes by throwing barbs every once in a while as Yoriyuki and Kyokaku spoke silently to each other in the background in that adult conversation manner. Then after a quick sort of luncheon, Ganju had herded them along a secret path into the Godi I-13 after Kyokaku's boisterous goodbye and bone-crushing hugs. It had all been a whirlwind experience, but the twins had developed a fondness for the strange Shiba clan as they followed their uncle, Yoriyuki sitting daintily on her sister's shoulder with all the airs and graces one would expect from a feline. The entryway they had been led to was small and barely noticeable, less of a door and more a cohesion of bricks assembled just right. They had bid Ganju goodbye, who had blubbered a bit, but in the sort of manly way, who had, in turn, wished them luck and extracted a promise from Yuzu to visit again and share recipes. As soon as they had stepped foot into Soul Society, alarms had blared. Yoriyuki on Yuzu's shoulder had startled, as surprised at the unexpected alarm as the twins, who were also harboring a great deal of worry hidden beneath courage. The cat had wryly commented that she hadn't heard these alarms before, though they weren't particularly the worst type one could hear apparently, and muttered about pesky paranoid scientists before urging the two into the alcove they were currently hiding in as a wave of Shinigami after Shinigami ran past. "Can't the Shinigami sense Reisu?" Yuzu questioned softly, voice strung tense like strings on a harp but still like steel with courage as the blonde twin glanced up at the cat now perched on Karen's shoulder. Golden eyes, like liquid sunlight, blinked at the question before the cat grinned, if cats could grin in any case, and responded sagely, "Well, you both are hiding your Reisu." But yes, usually most common Shinigami are able to sense Reisu. However, if those Shinigami were from the 11th, which we're semi-close to, it would be a surprise if they could manage a low-level Kido. It wasn't always like this though. Soul Society used to be much weaker before your uncle arrived. People always say things like that about Ichi Nii. That he improved Soul Society, changed the world or something with his presence, but no one ever says how. Karen commented with a scowl, letting her eyes roll heavenward for a moment as she took a deep inhale. She recalled the multiple such instances before her gaze once more flickered to the street, and the hand attached firmly to her katana twitched as the voice of their Zanpakuto hummed throughout her soul. Yoriyuki laughed, a deep rumbling sound that trailed from the tips of beaded paws into Karen's shoulder along with the pinpricks of dagger-like claws. Ichigo changed Soul Society in many ways, but primarily he insisted the Shinigami Academy focus lessons more on developing individual skill, producing more competent Shinigami that wouldn't serve as cannon fodder. Then with a bit of prodding the Suteiko, he changed the hierarchy so that while there may only be one captain of each division, there can now be multiple lieutenants, and third seats, which helps to relieve the pressure of paperwork, and opens up positions for powerful Shinigami. Then there was the war with Hueco Mundo, which boosted the confidence and unity of the Shinigami, and a bit more. Though that wasn't directly Ichigo, he was involved for sure, but no one can pin it down. I mean, I could, but then there would be no blackmail material for the Shinigami Women's Association. Yoriuki finished with a low cackle that was the rumble of the devil upon the air, still hushed but daring all the same. Karen frowned as she processed the avalanche of information the captain had shoved into such a short space of a breath. Karen noted what she hadn't said by focusing only on their uncle's effect on Seoul society in general and the soldiers and glossing over some topics such as the Suteiko, who they had heard of from their father. Furthermore, from what was spoken of about the Winter Wars and beyond sounded like their uncle was more of a schemer than they had originally suspected. They had always known though, even when they only reached Ichigo's knee, that their uncle wasn't normal, and not in the weird Shinigami term of the word. Their uncle had always had something otherworldly about himself, as if he had looked at something so shocking that the rest of the world could only hope to catch a glimpse of the memory. They had spoken to their parents about, but both had soothed the questions with a practiced ease. Karen could almost sense her twin's thoughts running along the same line, and as the ebony-haired sister glanced over she could see Yuzu sprawled against the wall, biting her lip with furrowed brows and one hand hovering over her zanpakuto. As Karen peered around the corner once again, trusting Yuzu's instincts and the discreet sign of potential hostility, more out of caution than true necessity, the alarms blaring cut off one by one, leaving only the ever-disconcerting hum of Reisu surrounding her and the fading echo of sandals on paved streets. "Do you think it's safe to move on now?" Yuzu questioned tentatively as she slid to stand beside Karen with a fluid grace she had picked up from their mom, glancing at the near-empty streets with open curiosity. The cat on Karen's shoulder shifted, digging her claws in a bit as she resettled before answering, "It should be fine, you both look the part, and if anyone asks just say you're from the 10th, your uncle's divisions." The cat finished calmly, deep baritone rumbling off the walls for a moment before drifting off and fading into the solemn silence that seemed to linger with age. Seeing the endless sprawl of white buildings that formed the large part of the Godai 13 had been awe-inspiring, even for Karen, as the sun crested the skies, and the stone seemed not so much glow but to almost hum in a visible manner with the Reisu that was overly ambient about Seoul society. Glancing at her younger sister, Karen could see that the blonde was slightly reassured by the answer, and that was more than enough for Karen, who had often simply decided on following her sister's decisions when possible. It made things easier most times, and Karen was more than assured of her own autonomy to their parents' relief. Shrugging her shoulders, the eldest Kurosaka sibling glanced up to Yoriuki and asked, "So where to next, Yoriuki?" The cat cocked her head for a moment in thought before she jumped off Karen's shoulder. Strolling out of their small alcove with a prideful strut, she said with amusement to her tone, "We should go and see Byakuya, he'll likely have some clue as to what we need to do considering how close he is with Ichigo." Karen shared a quick look with Yuzu, one that was shared doubts and fueled curiosity, before they tentatively stepped into the cobbled streets of Seoul society and followed the feline gracefully walking in front of them. As the quiet silence lingered once more between the three, Yuzu softly questioned, "Yoriuki-san, why are you in your feline form? Aren't you a captain still? And do you know why Ichinii isn't here?" At the question that had been lingering on both twins' minds, Yoriuki laughed, the deep rumbling sound almost akin to a purr bounding throughout the street as gold eyes were turned their way to pin them in place with all the gravity of a ship falling from the skies. The cat sat down in the middle of the street and with a feline smile replied, "It's more fun that way. And your uncle apparently had an important lead on something he's been working on for literally centuries." Karen shared a pensive glance with Yuzu at the response, one where they lamented that most Shinigami were insane, and wondered what their uncle was searching for. The ebony-haired twin bumped her shoulder against Yuzu's in reassurance and support, and with a determined nod, the two followed the cat, who was once more gliding through the streets as if she owned them. After what felt like an eternity of walking, where they questioned the lack of shunpo and received yet more laughter before being forced to chase the cat, a speed demon from hell, they passed by a long staircase. Yoriuki confided with a wink and a secretive tone as they slowed to a tentative stop that it led to Sokioku Hill, which hadn't been used for centuries but was for executions. At the mention of its purpose, Yuzu paused in her careful steps, a frown splitting her features and more burning in her eyes. Sensing her sister's hesitation and reflecting the same dark thoughts, Karen's hand drifted to her own blade as her instincts screamed in warning and their zanpakuto hummed warm and furious. Yoriuki continued walking for a few moments, her form like wispy shadows against the dull cobblestones, before she too halted and turned to face the girls with calculating eyes. As the tense silence in the small courtyard continued to swell, Yoriuki's ears bowed, and with something like apology mixed with glee she said, I'm going to run ahead, stay here. Then the cat disappeared around the corner in a blur of shunpo that was like dust on the wind before either of the twins could call for the cat to halt. When Karen glanced at her younger sister, Yuzu was sporting a dismayed and helpless look, one that Karen could feel bubbling inside her chest. They trusted Yoriyuki, but they also knew she was the same sort of kin as Kisuk, which meant plotting, and maybe why she had run off had their best interest at heart in the end, but there had also been some other subplot of that Karen was sure. It was like a sense of betrayal, but one where you knew the chance of it happening was likely, which lessened the blow somewhat. It still left Karen irritated as all hell. Yuzu beside Karen stiffened suddenly, and the instincts that had rung throughout Karen's system like the toll of Soul Society's own alarms once more blared to life. A Shinigami appeared at one of the many entrances to the courtyard with a billow of Reisu that was wild and untamed like a feral animal stalking towards them. The Shinigami had outrageously red hair, almost more shocking than their uncle's. He had tattoos sprawling across his forehead, and Karen knew there were likely more beneath the shiakusho he wore, and there was a zanpakuto sheathed at his side. The twins shared a startled look at the appearance of the Shinigami, one who was a lieutenant if the badge on his shoulder was any indication, and the cast of his face, which reminded them both somewhat of the Karakura thugs before they had convinced them all to get jobs or join their gang, reminded them of that same will to fight. Halt! You're the Ryoka who invaded the Godi I-13. I will stop whatever plans you have for Soul Society. The Shinigami lieutenant challenged dramatically, a serious expression lining his features and tipping it with outright hostility as the blade in his hand hummed and Reisu filled the small courtyard. Yuzu beside Karen shivered, whether with fear or the chills spiraling throughout the air at the dense Reisu. Karen couldn't say, only that she felt the same. They both knew that fighting the lieutenant would be dangerous. They could potentially lose their lives, though if Yoriyuki had been here she would have been able to halt the lieutenant. Instead, they could try and run and risk encountering another Shinigami, perhaps even a captain, and make it difficult for Yoriyuki to find them in the endless maze of Soul Society, not to mention the possibility of a chase. They had no idea of the man's skills. So, sharing a silent look, one where Yuzu insisted on reason but accepted the inevitable, the blonde twin turned to face the lieutenant and said honestly, "We are not the Ryoka, we are here with Shiho and Teiko to speak to Kukaki Teiko. It is a matter of great importance to the safety of a friend." The crimson-haired Shinigami blanched for a moment at Yuzu's words before he peered closely at the two with eyes driven like a cobra striking from the grass. There was something in the lieutenant's features that Karen noticed as she stared blankly back, something lost or confused, perhaps best described as unbalanced. After a second, which felt as if it had been seeped in some viscous substance, the lieutenant frowned, shaking his head in denial. He replied, "You're lying. If you were with Shiho and Teiko, then why did the alarms go off when they detected souls from the mortal world, and where is she? Why are you here, Ryoka? To exploit our supposed weakness after the Winter War like all the others? To attack Kukaki Teiko? I won't let you." Karen caught a distressed look from her sister and sent a calming wave of Reisu towards her younger sibling, who straightened at the support and cast a small smile at Karen, one with all the strength of the earth grasped there. Karen's hand tightened at the sheathed katana at her side as a wind blew through the courtyard and the stairs whistled with the force of it. The Shinigami continued to study them with wary caution, blade glinting in warning as Yuzu attempted to convince the Shinigami once more and said, "We're substitute Shinigami who live in the mortal realm but work for Soul Society. We're from the Shiba clan. Please seek out your captain to confirm such. We've come to save a friend, a Shinigami who's been forgotten and kidnapped. Her name is Rukia Kukaki and we need to speak Kukaki Teiko." The lieutenant recoiled as if he had been physically struck by the name, even as confusion plastered itself across his angled features, once more dangerously swinging towards unbalanced. The redhead shook his head, anger igniting in his eyes as he lifted his zanpakuto and said, "I am Renji Aburai's lieutenant of the 6th Division and I will not let you pass, Ryoka." Yuzu frowned at the rough response as around the Shinigami Reisu began to gather and the twins repeated the action. Karen hid the grin, threatening to pull at her lips, knowing the adrenaline kicking in and the prospect of a fight shouldn't distract her, and instead let determination crease her features as the twins drew their katana from their sheaths with a familiar hiss of metal. "Yuzu, handle defense, I'll handle the offense." Karen spoke quietly to her sibling, a rough battle plan forming in her thoughts as she considered the man in front of them. He was taller than the twins, appeared to be a combat/close-range fighter as opposed to someone long distance, had greater strength and reach than the twins, and would have Shikai and maybe Bankai. Yuzo nodded to the battle plan out of the corner of Karen's peripheral vision as she kept her gaze firmly fixed on the Shinigami, and Karen quietly added, "Use speed and Kido. He's physically stronger and has a longer reach, use tactic too." The blonde twin nodded once more, content to let Karen handle the planning and strategy. Yuzo was a miracle at using Kido and finessing Reisu control and sensitivity to the finest degree, hence her speciality with her Quincy powers. Karen, on the other hand, could manage a few Kido at most. It was tactics and swordplay she could handle. The silence lingered for a moment before the red-haired lieutenant lunged forward, blade whistling through the air like a discordant warning note. Karen stepped to the side of the attack as Yuzo darted around to his blind spot, and Karen swung her Zanpakuto overhead, adding gravity to her momentum as the lieutenant was temporarily off balance. The man turned at the last second, using it as a feint to jab towards Karen's torso even as her Zanpakuto snapped quickly to guard, and a Shakuho burst into existence across the Shinigami's left shoulder in a scorch of crimson Reisu. The redhead scowled and turned to face Yuzo, displaying his unprotected back to Karen, a rookie move the ebony-haired twin was only too happy to take advantage of as she slid forward. The lieutenant whipped around at the last second as Karen's katana sung through the air, cleaving towards the Shinigami's shoulder, quick instincts saving the man's spine. Aburai caught the blade against his own with a screech that resonated throughout the courtyard, and Karen pushed on the force of gravity as her advantage as she forced the blade towards his neck in the flash and grind of steel. At the last moment Aburai ducked and his leg swept out to trip Karen, narrowly dodging a binding Kido from Yuzo with the motion, which Karen hurriedly dodged as she jumped over the leg and flash stepped back a half pace before moving forward once more to crash against the lieutenant's blade from the air as Reisu solidified beneath her feet. They continued to pace through the open courtyard in a blur of shunpo that swept dust into the air like a miniature sandstorm as Yuzo covered Karen's back and fired low-powered Kido to distract the lieutenant and attempted to bind his arms. As their blades forced against one another in a clash of sparks and wool, Karen could feel the lieutenant's slightly greater strength even as she used her speed and shunpo to dart around and attack from the air once more. The lieutenant turned at the last minute, Zanpakuto snapping up as they scrapped with a loud screech, and Karen reversed her blade and slashed towards the man's unprotected thigh, scoring a deep gash before she was forced to defend against a furious onset. As Aburai continued to slice, sliding from one combo to the next, scoring a few gashes across Karen's skin, the older twin used her speed as an advantage to score a few hits of her own, the battle pulling her senses into hyper-focus as all other thoughts fled. After a minute, the two opponents broke away. Light breathing filled the air along with the copious amounts of Reisu and rubble the three fighters had released. Aburai scowled at the twins. It was a scowl that sharpened the eyes and echoed something lost about the man, for all the crazed high of a fight ignited the man's fervor. With a surge of Reisu like a falling wave, the Shinigami brought his blade in front of him and with a wicked grin called out, "Roar Zabumaru!" The Zanpakuto in his hands shifted, extending outwards, and shaping itself so that it had small filaments in between the metal parts with spikes that extended outwards. Karen internally grimaced, wondering at the unknown Shikai before her, even as she shared a questioning glance with her sister before agreeing to wait. Their Shikai could wait till absolutely necessary. With another breath, the lieutenant surged forward and his blade extended in front of him, reaching out towards Karen. The raven-haired twin jerked out of the way of the blade, using her speed to gain distance even as she prepared a counter-assault and darted in from the air. The Shinigami raised his Zanpakuto, which was once more not extended, and caught the two with a screech of metal before he threw her off and let his blade follow the movement. Karen rolled underneath the large blade that shot through the air like a cobra, and as she rose shot a Shakuho towards the red-haired Shinigami, who caught it on his already injured shoulder. The man growled and his Zanpakuto once more extended, whipping out wicked fast towards Karen, who jerked to the side and dodged under the swing and rolled to the side only to swiftly shunpo away as the blade snapped once more towards her neck. As it cut towards her a third time, Karen was too slow to dodge the blade entirely as it cut into her arm with all the bite of a serrated knife before retracting once more towards its owner. Muffling a yell and knowing her sister was likely horrified, Karen glanced through her bangs at Aburai as she darted towards her sister. Yuzo was pale, a healing Kido collecting faintly around her hands as she studied Karen before it faded at the look on the raven-haired twin's face. They couldn't continue battling the lieutenant without releasing their Shikai. It was tantamount to suicide with the man's skill and his Zanpakuto, though Karen had a certain idea about how to defeat it. Letting their Reisu rise slightly untamed, the twins turned to face their opponent as they let their blades interlock, Reisu gathering and sparking about the two as the air grew oppressive and heavy like a summer heat wave. Karen gave Yuzu a promising smile as their Zanpakuto hummed throughout their minds, the blades vibrating with almost physical tension. Before they could release their Shikai, another Shinigami appeared, his Reisu overpowering, cutting through their attempt to release Shikai with open shock. He wore a captain's Haori, had silver jewelry in his hair, and Yoryuki on his shoulder. The man, who was likely Captain Kukaki, surveyed the battle with something close to an amused smile before he intoned with something dangerous and menacing, "Lieutenant Abarai." X. Yuzu shivered as the fading sunlight of Soul Society cast long shadows on the buildings surrounding them, and the rustle and chatter of what was called Rungokai listed restlessly as if the very air was strung tight. Rukia had only spoken once of the neighborhood she'd grown up in, talking briefly with set eyes about the state of most of Rungokai, although that had apparently changed, about the many friends who had passed on to the next life. It had been in the quiet of the morning after a night of fighting hollows, and the fading buzz of adrenaline had made them all a bit tipsy and willing to speak. The twins had spoken about their mother and the attack by the hollow, about life in the mortal world, and Rukia had opened up in kind. But to hear it all from the man who was Rukia's older brother, and practically Ichigo's spouse, had been eye-opening. To hear of how he had found Rukia, and the young captain's wife Hisuna, Rukia's older sister. The office of the captain had lingered with a solemn silence as the elegant Shinigami spoke about his family, gazing out the windows with warm fondness and damp sadness in his eyes, carefully guarded as they were. The twins had listened in rapt attention, Yuzu's more empathic nature mourning the man's loss, while Karen listened with the same kind of understanding. Their former opponent sulked in the corner with carefully jaded eyes, expression troubled and frayed at the edges, and Yoryuki had been a vague presence, listening with knowing eyes and something like fondness for the captain. After Byakuya had finished speaking of where they could likely find Rukia, her home in Rungokai where she had grown up according to Hisuna, he had stared at them silently for a minute. It hadn't been intense or warning, or any other manner of intimidation. It had simply been the man observing them with something close to warmth to his cool silver eyes. After a moment, the captain of the 6th had turned away and spoke quietly and remorsefully that their uncle could not be there, but he was there if they needed anything. Later Yuzu would wonder how everything could have turned out if no one in Soul Society knew them or was available to help. Yuzu wondered if they would have had to fight their way through Soul Society and beyond to save their friend. Yoryuki had commented at that point, mentioning that at least Aizen Teiko, the captain of the 12th and apparently one of Ichigo's close friends, they were learning a lot about their uncle, had been warned of impending scientific disaster. The two had shared a strange laugh over Yoryuki's grinning words as the twins and the redhead Shinigami had been left to flounder in confusion. Yuzu had caught Karen's trail of thought of weird Shinigami with a muffled smile, knowing that even their father's eccentricities could never have prepared them for the wonderful mess Soul Society was. Yuzu snapped out of her pensive recollection as Karen jostled her shoulder with a charming grin full of teeth, one that most anyone facing Karen would call predatory, but Yuzu found it highlighted all the nice aspects of her older sister. There was a serious cast to the raven-haired twin beneath the smiling exterior, though one that belayed how they both felt. The twins were both hesitant and cautious as they walked through the emptying streets of Rungokai, Yuzu's senses guiding the way as she traced one of the only large Reisu presences, but there were others, a militia of some sorts apparently, in the district with careful finesse that had long become habit. They both had unspoken questions running through their minds. Whether they could save Rukia. Who had taken her in the first place? If they would ever remember the friend who had saved their lives? The questions buzzed beneath their skin and gnawed at their thoughts like a horde of locusts upon summer crops, and Yuzu secretly despised the insecurity of it all and wondered how the Shinigami managed to deal with incident after incident. If she was them, she would have gone a bit insane too. The familiar Reisu of their Zanpakuto spirit washed over the twins in a burst of warmth that soothed their senses like a rich cup of cocoa on a winter night, or sitting by the fire, chasing away lingering doubts. Fingers drifting to the ornate red tassel attached to the hilt of her Zanpakuto, Karen didn't have one solely on principle, but she did have a metal ring of almost chains attached. Yuzu exhaled, and refocused her attention on saving their friend. They couldn't afford to let their minds wander. On a whole, unlike the Shinigami, the twins were relatively lacking in battle experience. They dealt with everyday hollows, and occasionally an upper-level one, but most of their advanced training came from when Ichigo visited or when they demanded Kisuke or one of the visiting Shinigami teach them. That wasn't to say they weren't powerful, because they were. But power never equated experience. Karen had whispered a bitter remark about adults shoving responsibilities onto teens' shoulders, and for once Yuzu had understood their uncle's insistence on keeping them out of the eye of Seoul society. Byakuya could have attempted to save his sister, Renji could have accompanied them, though they both knew Yoriuki was following them, or hell the Suteiko could probably have dealt with the situation in a minute. But in some ways Yuzu was grateful they were able to help their friend, because they owed her a debt, even if they couldn't remember it. Sharing a determined nod with her sister, one that also beckoned the raven-haired twin to follow, Yuzu launched into a quick shunpo, muddling through the vast pools of Reisu like an ocean that was Seoul society. They landed at the foot of a hill rising over the nearby outskirts of a town where women took in the laundry and children ran about as worried mothers called for them to come in. The hill itself was relatively small compared to Sokioku Hill, but held a sense, something lingering all the same. Karen's Reisu rustled like a cat bristling for a moment before it settled and sharpened like a wolf baring its teeth as the raven-haired twin glanced over to share a confident quirky smile with the younger sibling, one that was reassuring even if Yuzu didn't need it as she fondly bumped shoulders with the older Kurosaki. It was at a moment like this, right before the next battle, that she wished she could manifest her Quincy powers, feel the strength of her mother's powers reinforcing her. As familiar as she was now with the Shinigami aspect of her powers, she would always find her comfort zone in the familiar draw of a Quincy bow. Karen was the same, but in reverse, their Zanpakuto calling to her. It suited the two more than fine when they were proficient enough in both to easily surprise their enemies. They landed at the top of the hill with a quiet ripple of grass and instantly spotted three silhouettes painted against the backdrop of the sinking sun, graves like a solemn parade laid out behind them. There was a girl with blonde hair with red dashing across the front of it wearing a white dress, a boy with the same outfit, black hair, and a wicked scythe, and behind them stood a woman who could only be Rukia for the remarkable resemblance she bore to the picture of Byakuya's late wife. Rukia! Karen shouted, happy at seeing their friend alive and whole, and maybe somewhat confused at the appearance of the boy and girl. Said strangers whipped around to face the twins with hostility plain on their features and desperation clinging there with a similar fervor. Rukia jerked back in confusion when Karen called her name, eyes like the crystals that formed on the grass in winter staring at the twins with a lost expression and plain confusion. Who are you? The woman questioned softly in a manner that seemed almost vulnerable as the Shinigami's gaze darted to the boy and girl who were regarding the Kurosaki twins with obvious suspicion and the imminence of battle hanging cleanly above their heads. Yuzu reached out to grasp her sister's wrist. Halting Karen's somewhat brash response, Yuzu let her gaze stare into Rukia's blue eyes, willing their friend to remember as she replied, I'm Yuzu and this is Karen, you saved our lives through your intervention in a battle. Your family in Seoul society misses you and is concerned, your older brother Byakuya is worried and confused. Please, we need to return to the Godai 13 to sort this situation out. Peacefully. Yuzu spoke as diplomatically as possible, keeping her voice steady and with only gentle inflection allowing the honesty of the situation to guide her actions as she continued to gaze into the eyes of their friend. Rukia blinked in confusion, mouthing their names and Byakuya's before with a cry of pain Rukia sunk to her knees and her hands reached up to cradle her head. The blonde twin muffled the concern bubbling inside her chest as the heavy glares of the boy and girl were sent their way. What are you doing? Stop it, you're hurting Rukia. You can't take her away from us again. The girl yelled furiously, eyes blazing as a Reisu that flowed like sand upon the seafloor but was the color of death seeped out from the blonde girl. The boy at her side moved to stand protectively in front of Rukia, the scythe in his hand glimmering in the light of evening with the same dark Reisu as the girl crouched in front of Rukia speaking to her in soft tones. Karen beside Yuzu stiffened, a hand straying to the katana sheathed at her side even as Yuzu could feel the confusion and uncertainty her older sister broadcasted. Taking a deep breath, Yuzu pulled her Reisu tightly around her and responded with pleading tones and truth to her tone, please, we don't want to hurt Rukia, or take her away. We just want to bring her back to Seoul society so that the others can remember her. We don't want to separate you. Rukia shifted at their words, wobbling to her feet in unsteady movements that cast the appearance she was as frail as to fall in the next gust of wind. The boy and girl traded a silent look as riots ruffled through the grass in haunting echoes. Their gazes were heavy with distrust and a pain that Yuzu couldn't identify, something deep and dark. With a scowl, the boy stepped forward as the blonde supported Rukia and challenged, you're lying. You just want to take Rukia away again. Again, so they had known Rukia in the past, Yuzo concluded with a frown even as the boy's Reisu roiled through the air and the scythe was swept in a menacing manner. As the night skies continued to darken with overcast clouds, the boy stepped forward and said, "I won't let you take Rukia away from us." Seeing the obvious challenge of battle, Yuzo glanced to the side and caught Karen's gaze, burning with determination and the will to fight to save their friend. The Kurosaka twins shared a faint nod, and Yuzo caught the basic gist of Karen's plans as the elder Kurosaka sibling unsheathed her katana with a hiss that was like a snake slithering through the grass waiting to strike. The field swept itself into tense coils as Rukia watched with wide eyes from beneath the protective covering of the girl, and the boy frowned at them with eyes sharp and deadly. Gathering Reisu beneath her feet, Yuzo mentally recited the Kido she could use to hopefully subdue the girl and boy without causing injury. If they could, they would avoid hurting them, even if the hollow Reisu burning the air in their lungs indicated some unhidden tale. Karen and the boy moved forward at the same time, blades clashing with a great shriek as Karen's struggled against the scythe's unusual shape. Like the whisper of a breeze, Yuzo cloaked herself in a Kido that hid her appearance from idle observance and moved to a position where she could fire Kido without worrying about hitting Karen. Beginning a binding Kido, Yuzo watched as Karen moved like a whip, darting in and out using her smaller stature and speed to score the occasional gash as her blade whipped like an extension of her arm. The boy matched her movements carefully, using his scythe to generate motion and wider swings. Some part of Yuzo wished to be there aiding her sister in the fight, battling beside her, but Yuzo knew when it came to simple swordplay Karen would insist on fighting their opponent with Yuzo acting as support. However, if they released their Shikai, Yuzo would be in the thick of it beside her sister and their enemies would promptly cower. Chasing away the vindictive thought, the type she usually kept close to her chest for rare occasions, Yuzo spotted an opening in the boy's defense and released the binding Kido. The glowing spell slammed into the boy, sending him sprawling backwards to land beside his female companion and Rukia. A spare second later, accompanied by a surge of roiling Reisu, the Kido was broken, but at the same moment, Yuzo released a Shakuho. The boy caught the red spell on his scythe, eyes surveying his surroundings before he was forced to defend against Karen's aggressively refined attacks. While Karen fought in a blur of Shunpo, Yuzo's eyes drifted to Rukia and the girl. She wondered if she could speak to them and try to convince them to see reason. They didn't need to fight them. Yuzo knew she was being soft with the thought, but at the same moment, she didn't want to hurt Rukia if they truly knew her. Releasing a hail of Byakurai, Yuzo stealthily crossed the hill, the grass parting with her movements until she was standing near in front of Rukia and the girl. Crouching a fair distance out of severing range, Yuzo dispelled the Kido clinging to her skin slowly so it appeared that she simply faded into existence. The blonde jerked back in shock, even as Rukia's eyes widened into saucers, confusion and familiarity abounding hand in hand in crystal blue eyes. "Please, we don't want to separate you from Rukia. If you both come back with us to Soul Society and return everyone's memories, you would be able to stay with Rukia. You would likely even be accepted. Soul Society isn't as prejudiced as it once was," which Yuzo was parroting, "and they would welcome you. Please, we don't want to hurt anyone." Yuzo spoke softly, voice warm and honest as she stared into the lost eyes of the girl in front of her. Rukia pressed against the girl's side, shifted forward to regard Yuzo carefully. One tentative hand reached out to rest a tentative palm on Yuzo's cheek, the flesh cool with the night air. The atmosphere lingered between the three women as the blonde girl glanced between Yuzo and Rukia before her gaze darted to her brother and Karen. Suddenly the tentative peace was disrupted as the boy was sent flying towards the three and Yuzo moved in one smooth motion, unsheathing her blade to catch the large scythe against her katana. The boy stared into her eyes with something close to fury even as Yuzo ducked under the blade and Karen attacked from the side, drawing the boy's attention. Instinct screaming in warning, Yuzo whipped around to face the blonde as a punch was sent her way. Yuzo ducked under the blow and sprung back a half-step, Reisu bubbling beneath her skin as she prepared a Kido. Frowning as Yuzo's eyes darted to Rukia, who was standing alone regarding everything with a lost expression, and to the blonde, the Kurosaka twin questioned, "Why are you attacking me? We don't want to fight you." The blonde frowned again, lips curling downwards, and in another second surged forward. Yuzo stepped to the side to avoid the punch but paused, surprise as the girl kept moving forward, darting into the duel to stand beside her brother. Sparing Rukia a quick glance accompanied by a reassuring smile, Yuzo rushed to join the fray and ignored the curses she could feel her sister mouthing. Karen was dodging the blonde's clumsy strikes even as she fought against the boy's wicked scythe, and Yuzo slipped into the flow of it easily, Reisu gathering around her hands as she released a Shakuho followed by a binding Kido. The Kido hit the girl, who tumbled back at the force of it, and the boy followed, catching the girl easily as Black Reisu rolled across the ground in a slow creeping motion. The Kurosaki twins faced the boy and the girl from across the field, the night air sharp and biting as clouds hung heavy and ominous. Karen flicked her Zanpakuto slightly, a silent command to prepare for Shikai if necessary. They didn't want to hurt the boy and the girl, and if they could take them in without injuring them it would be best. As much as they wanted to acquiesce to the demands of the souls in front of them, Rukia was their friend, and above all, they wouldn't leave her behind. The two opposing forces readied to charge, Reisu filling the air like thunder and lightning as the twins' Zanpakuto hummed in their minds. With the space of a breath, they charged forward, the earth blurring beneath their feet as they rushed forward. Both sides came to a halt as Rukia appeared in the center of the field. Whether she had used Shunpo was a mystery that no one would likely solve anytime soon. Rukia held up both hands to halt all four of them and flashed the Kurosaki twins a quick reassessing smile before she faced the boy and girl with a soft smile, something wondrous and warm in her eyes. "Please, don't fight over me. Homura, Shizuku." Here Rukia paused to nod to the boy and then the girl before continuing, "I don't want you to be hurt, I'll still be friends with you, I value you. But I have duties I need to attend to, family. You're my family, you will be welcomed in Soul Society. Please stop fighting." The boy and girl, Homura and Shizuka, regarded Rukia with wide eyes in obvious shock at the names, tears springing into the girl's eyes as she stared at Rukia. Yuzu shared a surprised glance with Karen, who had a grin tugging at the corner of her lips that Yuzu could feel on her own lips. After a minute, the girl and boy nodded and Rukia grinned bright and blinding as Homura and Shizuka rushed forward to embrace the raven-haired Shinigami. There would still be problems to solve. The matter of the Hollow Ryutsu and everyone's memory of Rukia was a few, but Yuzu knew they would make it through it. As Karen fondly bumped her shoulder against Yuzu's, the twins shared a relieved smile watching their friend embrace the boy and girl, knowing everything would be okay. Ichigo lilted into their room, exhaustion dragging at his steps. Blearily he reminded himself to apologize to Anohana when he spoke to her when he woke up, which would be sometime in the next week if it wasn't a life or death situation. A candle painted the room in soft shades of gold, highlighting familiar sheets, ornaments, and the like, which settled something tense in his chest, the paranoia of battle and the hunt slipping away as Ichigo's Reisu blindly reached out for a familiar presence. The orange-haired Shinigami exhaled softly as he found who he was looking for and pulled himself together enough to slip out onto the porch. Byakuya was sitting on one of the steps, a cup of sake wisping steam into the night air in graceful arcs as the captain of the Sixth stared into the dark that blanketed the skies. Ichigo knew Byakuya had already sensed his presence, and so with little dramatics Ichigo dropped to the step beside his partner, the movement jostling exhausted muscles. Piercing silver eyes slowly crawled their way over Ichigo, noting the obvious signs of exhaustion and the hints of triumph gathered in Ichigo's brown eyes, which in the light of the oil lamps glinted like burnished copper. Wordlessly Byakuya handed over his cup of sake and Ichigo smiled in thanks, leaning against the man with a sigh that seemed to hold the weight of the world in its grasp. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Byakuya questioned quietly, respectful of the silence of the night that lingered, broken only by Mother Nature's hand. Ichigo's eyes flickered at the question as he glanced into the cup of sake, warming his hands with an indescribable expression before he replied in a tone that rustled like leaves across the ground, "Not what, but whom." The captain of the Sixth's eyes widened at the answer and he regarded his partner with a careful look as Ichigo took a slow sip of the hot liquid, fingers tracing nonsensical patterns along the ceramic. The images flashed through Ichigo's mind, years of research and wondering, questioning, and curiosity, answered and non-answers all bound together into one great revelation and 100 new mysteries. One hand unconsciously drifted to Zanjutsu's hilt as Ichigo replied in a voice that conveyed a need for secrecy, "The person who wrote the book, they're still alive. I don't know how or where, but things that have been happening, that shouldn't have been happening without intervention like Aizen's, have been happening. Labs and inventions that shouldn't exist unless, whispers of a kami among far-reaching souls, things that don't make sense." Ichigo repressed a shiver as he finished, eyes staring sightlessly as he recalled the labs, the notes, the people who spoke in whispered tones in the dark, the chase from one district to the next blurring together as guilt ate at his chest, knowing he wasn't there to support his sisters. Byakuya, who had radiated soft astounded shock, leaned carefully into Ichigo Reisu, reaching out to comfort his partner as he recognized certain symptoms that always occurred when Ichigo was exhausted. It felt like deja vu of some kind, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem malevolent or benevolent, just something that is. The orange-haired Shinigami trailed off, blinking, the weariness filling his eyes away as he tried to hold on to his thoughts, grasping at them like the last wisps of a dream. Byakuya frowned at the words Reisu fluttering like cherry blossoms in the wind before the man leaned closer to Ichigo and turned so that he could stare into eyes that were unbroken with determination, reforged countless times. "We'll figure everything out, Ichigo, everything, everyone will be safe. For now, you need to rest, and then you can lecture the twins, and then Kaian will lecture you, and we can wander Rungo Kai and run into Yuka Take Teiko and Kiriraku Teiko and somehow end up swindled into paying the bill and in a drinking contest, and your lieutenant will yell at you, and we'll keep living and we'll make it. Soul Society is strong, Ichigo, its soul is strong." Ichigo chortled a sleepy laugh at his partner's words and nodded, leaning against the man as Zanjitsu hummed, warm and content to be home again. He would take whatever was thrown his way and run with it, and Ichigo wouldn't have to do it alone. X. Chapter 65, Shibboleth. X. Ichigo let his gaze idly drift to the street in front of him, senses faintly searching their surroundings in a well-ingrained habit that he would likely never shake, not that he wanted to, when being aware of your surroundings could be the difference between life and death. Kaian walked beside him in the odd half-step walk he now maintained with the prosthetic attached to his calf. It was made of a foamy gray plastic and made a hollow sort of tapping sound as it clicked on the paved streets of Rungo Kai. When Sosuke had presented the false limb to the Shiba head with a sly but genuine smile, Kaian had almost cried, something vulnerable and soft in his eyes and the way his hands had shaken as if cradling new life that Ichigo had easily recognized. The limb wasn't the same as having a flesh and blood leg, it didn't solve everything. Kaian still had issues with mobility, he couldn't walk for too long on the prosthetic, and for all its support it was still a weakness in battle. But it provided the bright-eyed lieutenant with the ability to walk the streets of Soul Society and serve his family once more, allowing Kaian's personality to shine through again, with new purpose and wisdom. Kaian had been subdued in the months following the loss of his leg. It wasn't visible to the casual observer, or even likely to those who knew the man the best, but Ichigo was a master at recognizing deception, even to one's self. To see his brother's eyes glowing again with all the luminescence of the deep ocean settled something in Ichigo's chest, even if it came with the price of having the overly energetic brother bouncing along like a puppy at his side chattering a storm. "Ichigo." Kaian called his name in a long drawn-out whine that was inherently irritating in a way only a sibling could make a name sound. Heaving a long-suffering sigh, Ichigo ran a hand through his hair and with a grimace to his smile turned his attention to his brother. Kaian perked up slightly at receiving Ichigo's attention and not a sharp dismissal drenched heavily in snark before a pout tugged the lieutenant's lips towards the earth and the man plastered himself to Ichigo's side as he whined, "It's not fair." And the guessing game began. Ichigo thought with a roll of his eyes, wondering what it was this time his brother was whining about. It could be anything from the Shinigami Women's Association's new promo material, to Lisa being mean to him. After a second of lamenting, eyes upturned to the skies in prayer, Kaian turned sea blue eyes to Ichigo's unimpressed features and elaborated, "It's not fair that I didn't get to meet the twins. Kyukaku got to meet them, and Ganju. And meanwhile, they didn't even stop by the 13th. When am I going to get to meet those infamous sisters of yours, Ichigo?" Kaian finished with a deep petulant frown, and the orange-haired Shinigami currently plastered to his brother's side repressed the urge to rest his palm on his face or vent in some other physical manner. As much as Ichigo wanted to shut Kaian's whining down, he also sympathized slightly. The twins had already returned home by the time he returned, and while the knowledge set his worried heart at ease, Ichigo wished he could have spoken to Karen and Yuzo. He was beyond proud of them for how they had handled the situation. They had refrained from using their Quincy powers and revealing their Shikai, which in a place such as Soul Society was impressive in of itself, and they had managed to save the boy and the girl who had kidnapped Rukia, something Ichigo doubted he would have accomplished in their place. Part of Ichigo, the scheming part, was also incredibly happy with how everything had turned out. They had gained 2 new allies, and the twins' cover as simple substitute Shinigami had been maintained. "Ichigo, pay attention to me, don't leave me hanging." The lieutenant whined as he poked Ichigo on the cheek with a put-out look, eyes wavering with crocodile tears and a pout pulling at the lieutenant's lips. Delivering his brother a disbelieving look, Ichigo rolled his eyes and with a touch of admonishment and reassurance replied, "You'll probably get to meet them later, Kaian, and if you're really that desperate, I'm pretty sure that now Yuzu and Ganja have met, there will be future visits to trade recipes, and Karen will definitely want to try her hand at fighting you and seeing Kyokaku's explosives. Ichigo's older brother pursed his lips thoughtfully at the words before he nodded in agreement, posture slumping in defeat as he added, still, before he popped up into his usual chipper pose, and added, I'm just happy Rukia is okay, and that I can remember her. The orange-haired captain laughed at his brother's words, nodding in agreement as he fondly bumped his shoulder into Kaien's, who in return beamed at Ichigo for the semi-rare public displays of affection. As they continued walking through the streets of Rungokai, Ichigo keeping his pace slower so that Kaien wouldn't struggle, the lieutenant studying the packed earth beneath their feet added in a somewhat somber tone, it's strange what you find out about people that you never knew. I would never have imagined Rukia's past if she hadn't told me, growing up in Rungokai and stealing from the rich like a little vigilante or terror. I'm glad Sosuke will be able to help her friends, she deserves happiness for all she's experienced and so do they. In my own timeline they fused with Rukia and the only way to save her was to kill them, but in the end, it saved them, in the same way, slaying a hollow does. I think I like this ending better, especially considering how Shinigami or even souls with hollow Reisu aren't that strange anymore. Once Sosuke stabilizes them, Byakuya told me Rukia wants them to enter the academy and join the 13th. Ichigo responded quietly, fondness and happiness seeping into his tone even as he ignored the ominous truth of Kaien's words regarding his own past. Few souls knew what Ichigo had truly lived, and he intended it to stay that way even if the knowledge he held was beyond valuable. Kaien nodded with a smile as he absorbed the information, likely more than happy to hear of the fate of the girl and the boy, knowing it would make Rukia happy. Honestly, Ichigo's older brother had a knack for picking up strays, or even just children running around. He was evidence of the fact, and the captain had no doubt Kaien would soon be adopting the girl and boy as well. Fingers drifting lightly across the katana sheathed at his side as a wave of Ryutsu settled reassuringly across his shoulders, Ichigo idly observed Rungokai, the brats running through the streets, vendors selling their wares with boisterous shouts, the clamoring of life crowding about, and asked, have you heard of the new lieutenant in Rose's division? Kaien's eyes flickered from where they had been carefully watching children run throughout the street with crinkled eyes in a corner of a smile and focused their intensity upon Ichigo as the lieutenant responded, am a guy right? Seems a bit secretive, heard he was from a special task force or something. Heard he's trying to expand the Godai to a 14th so he can gain a captaincy, but otherwise seems honorable enough. The orange-haired captain nodded, a frown quirking his lips as he wondered how this situation would play out. He had already set some careful precautions in place, but as always Ichigo preferred to let fate guide her own hand. He knew trying to do so himself was nigh impossible. It was certainly interesting how things had already turned out, considering the man's attempts to gain a higher standing were alike to ones Ichigo had mused upon before. He wondered in vague thoughts if they could save the man from committing suicide and in a reoccurring pattern once more gain an ally. At Ichigo's continued silence, Kaien peered closer at the orange-haired Shinigami, sea-green eyes thick with scrutiny, before the lieutenant recoiled back and asked in an aghast tone, he's not another one, is he? Ichigo chuckled a touch evilly at his brother's concerned question, even as beneath the short-lived amusement he felt the exhaustion of it all weigh him down like lead wrapped around his ankles. If he was calculating right, they still had about 4 different incursions before the Quincy War, and that was chaos in of itself that Ichigo didn't want to deal with. Thinking of it alone made his head hurt. It all felt so strange. Looking back on everything that had happened, it seemed like only yesterday he was in the academy with Byakuya and now he was reaching the end of a lifelong mission. Ichigo didn't know what he would do afterwards, but some of the answers were present enough for him to grasp at ideas. Seriously? Kaien exclaimed a pitch higher than normal at Ichigo's non-answer before he slumped and groaned pitifully. Ichigo reassuringly pet his brother on the head, knowing it would irritate the lieutenant. He was also a sibling and there was a sort of vindictive pleasure in annoying one's siblings. Leveling Ichigo with a mutinous glare, Kaien morosely added, it's not fair. Ichigo nodded placatingly at the words that rung with an element of universal truth, even as Shiro echoed the sentiment in Ichigo's mind and Asen's deep chuckle accompanied the whining. Grinning softly to himself with a knowing look to the deep brown, Ichigo casually added, at least you didn't have to deal with huge grey worms. Huge grey what now? Kaien questioned as he stared Ichigo, cautiously noting the mischievous glint in his younger brother's eyes. Ichigo in response only winked and wandered ahead a few paces to browse the wares of a jeweler with a wide variety of glimmering pieces. As he idly observed the glowing jewels, his Reisu picked up on multiple approaching presences, and with a remorseful sigh he returned to Kyan's side and tapped his katana in a precise motion twice. The Shiba head twitched to attention at the silent signal, hand straying in a fluid motion to rest unassumingly on Nejibana's elegant hilt, eyes straying to their surroundings in intense scrutiny with an alertness to his movements that was a shift from the normally lackadaisical lieutenant. A moment later, a blur of bright crimson and gold collided with Ichigo's chest, forcing a rapid exhale of air. The orange-haired Shinigami jerked back at the motion but let his arms wrap instinctively around the girl in his arms as he carefully caught his balance and set her gently on the ground. Rurokiyo Kazumioji's bright green eyes stared up into Ichigo's own with something like fear balanced beneath a careful mask of cold indifference, lips set into a thin line and eyes uncaring with their hardness. The young heiress muttered an apology under her breath and made to jerk away from Ichigo's loose but careful hold, only to flinch as the sound of steel clashing against steel split the peaceful air of the Rungokai street. Glancing up, Ichigo caught sight of his brother locked in combat with one of the many assassins sent after the young girl in his arms. The assassin's Bakuto was a large javelin, but the man's skill was lacking with the weapon in comparison to the way Kyan flowed from move to move as fluid as the water he commanded. Nijibana was an extension of his arms as Kyan parried the assault and disarmed the assassin in an almost too fast motion. Knowing his brother had the situation handled, Ichigo returned his attention to the young heiress who was watching the battle with wide eyes and a tremor to her mouth. "Are you okay?" Ichigo questioned gently as if he was speaking to one of his sisters. The young girl flinched at his words before turning to face him fully, eyes carefully observing the captain's Haori artfully disguised as a simple Haori, because Ichigo didn't like to advertise his status, and perhaps of more note the Shiba insignia carefully carved into the wood of his sheath. Her eyes then flickered to Kyan, noting both their similar features, and as Kyan whipped around the tattoo proudly marking his forearm, before her gaze once more returned to Ichigo. "Are you from the Shiba clan?" Rurokiyo questioned tentatively, voice hesitant with a vulnerability to her expression that roused Ichigo's protective instincts. Nodding his head, the orange-haired captain crouched slightly so he could look into jewel-tone green eyes and questioned with careful understanding, "You're from the Kazumioji clan, aren't you? Are you okay? Do you need help? Do you know who's after you?" The girl nodded to his questions as a frown wrinkled her brow, aristocratic features sharpening as her gaze darted to the assassin now receiving Kyan's tender mercy for daring to attempt to hurt a child. Seeing the uncertainty cling at the edge of her features as she glanced around her, Ichigo reassured the youth, "It's okay, we won't let anyone hurt you, both as our duty as members of the Shiba clan, and as representatives of the Godai 13. Rurokiyo's eyes widened slightly before she nodded, stepping closer to Ichigo as if to absorb his warmth or protection, earning a wave of Reisu and a wink from the captain whose hand strayed easily to Zanjitsu's hilt. Ichigo's Reisu as it surveyed the area located the girl's attendants a short distance away, and as Kyan finished dealing with the assassins, Ichigo quietly reassured the youth, waiting till Kyan returned to hear the explanation he already knew. "Rurokiyo-sama." The girl's attendants called as they arrived in a flurry of dust and panic, katana at the ready as they regarded the scene with wide shocked eyes, almost comedic in their expressions. Ichigo muffled the urge to laugh at the scene but was mostly unsuccessful as Rurokiyo joined in with a brightness to her features Ichigo instantly decided he liked. Kyan at the same moment dragged the assassin over. The man had been immobilized with what looked to be a Kido spell but was still semi-conscious. Ichigo's older brother possessed a slightly disgruntled expression on his features as he plopped the dead weight beside his feet and shared a questioning glance with Ichigo, pain briefly gracing his features as he shifted on his feet. Ichigo flashed his brother a reassuring smile even as Rurokiyo greeted her attendants in a rush of whispers that were close to yelling. Kyan shifted uneasily on his feet, though there was less of a frantic motion to it now as his gaze darted to the young heiress with a raised brow that communicated a myriad of different questions, all centering on the child before them. The orange-haired Shinigami tapped Zanjitsu in response and winked, suggesting he would handle everything, which earned Ichigo a light scowl and a roll of Kyan's sea-green eyes. Noticing that the tearful reunion between the three souls had concluded, Ichigo coughed in a completely unsubtle way to draw everyone's attention to the situation at hand. With a nod to the attendants, Ichigo said, "I'm Ichigo Shiba and this is my brother Kyan Shiba, the head of the Shiba clan. If it would be acceptable to Kazumioji-san, we can return to the Shiba household where the situation can be explained in safety and the young heiress will be safe from would-be assassins." The attendants shared a silent talk over their lady's head that communicated their will to protect the blonde, even as Rurakiyo regarded Ichigo with hopeful eyes, leaving the man to wonder how long the youth had been on the run. It irked Ichigo slightly at the same time as he made peace with the fact that he wasn't omnipotent and couldn't predict everything. She reminded him slightly of Karen and Yuza with her rough attitude and kind appearance, which left Ichigo with a bunch of protective instincts he would rather shunt onto his brother. After a second of conference, where Ichigo carefully tracked the enclosing presences that were drawing ever nearer, Rurakiyo stepped forward and with an elegant bow stated, "The head of the Kazumioji clan accepts your offer and is in your debt." Kion grinned at the formal wording, and in a moment of seriousness as he took up the mantle of the Shiba head he responded with a deep bow accompanied by a friendly smile and bright eyes. Tapping 2 fingers against Zanjitsu, Ichigo said with quiet urgency, "Kion, please escort Kazumioji-san and her attendants to the compound. I will meet you there, but first I'll deal with our friends and bring them to Sosuke." The orange-haired Shinigami finished with a grin that bordered on terrifying to the unwary. Kion merely nodded, eyes flickering like a tsunami for all its power before the lieutenant smiled amicably, eyes knowing where they studied Ichigo with a certain gravity to them in the hand that strayed to Nejibana's hilt. Rurakiyo made to protest along with her attendants before Kion leaned over to whisper something in the heiress' ear, all visible tension dissipating at his words. With a wink, Kion led the 3 souls from the district in a blur of Shunpo, leaving the orange-haired Shinigami alone. Ichigo glanced at the unconscious assassin still chained by his feet and wondered at his life as 3 assassins flickered into existence, blades wicked like their warped Reisu. Ichigo sighed and unsheathed Zanjitsu with a sing of metal against sheath and sprung forward unhesitant and unwilling to give them an advantage. Zanjitsu cut through the air and colliding with a broad axe, the sound ringing out through the street and sending citizens scattering. Ichigo solidified Reisu beneath his feet and rose into the air as he used gravity to swing Zanjitsu overhead and cut through the large axe with a surge of Reisu. The assassin stared in stunned confusion, and Ichigo took mercy on the man and knocked him unconscious with Zanjitsu's pommel before he flipped around to catch the large end of the blade, not unlike something one might see used to fell horses. For assassins who were meant to be inconspicuous, they certainly used large weapons. Dodging under another swing, Ichigo sunk to a crouch as a katana swung over his head where his torso would have been. Sweeping one of his legs out, Ichigo tripped the man with the large broad blade and a second later popped to his feet and caught the katana on the broad edge of Zanjitsu before countering in a rapid flurry of blows. Sensing his other opponent rising and preparing for an attack, Ichigo cast a quick kiddo towards the katana user, who jumped out of the way as Ichigo pivoted and caught the large blade. Straining against the strength behind the attack, Ichigo dug his heels into the ground, and at the last moment as the assassin overstrained himself, Ichigo ducked under the blade, throwing the man off balance and delivered a strike with his pommel to the back of the man's neck. Turning to face the katana wielder, Ichigo caught sight of fear staining the assassin's features in broad strokes. Channeling Shiro, Ichigo let a wicked grin slip onto his features and gold bleed into his eyes. He said, "Tell your master that the head of the Kazumioji clan is under the protection of the Shiba clan." With pale features, the assassin disappeared in a blur of Shunpo, leaving the astounded crowd of Rungokai citizens who had come to watch the battle standing in shock, whispers breaking out in a way Ichigo knew would make their way to the Shinigami Women's Association. Running a hand through his hair, Ichigo resheathed Zanjitsu in a smooth practiced motion and carefully picked up the 3 unconscious assassins. Nodding once to the citizens, Ichigo left the crowded street in a burst of Shunpo, darting towards the 12th where Sosuke was likely sequestered away, having forgotten about the real world once again. Ichigo left the 3 assassins on the doorstep with instructions to deliver the 3 to Sosuke along with the name of the Kazumioji clan with a confused but resigned third seat. As much as the captain wanted to greet his friend in person and drag him out of the lab for real food, it was best not to keep his family waiting. He would just do it a few times in the next week when he returned for information. Turning away from the 12th, Ichigo listened to the hum of Asen's Reisu as he picked up speed and returned along familiar paths towards the main Shiba compound. Something in Ichigo's chest uncoiled as he landed in front of the building that had long become a home to him, the feel of his family's Reisu embedded in the very foundation of the building and the life that flourished about it. The orange-haired captain entered the Shiba compound quietly, nodding briefly to the many servants who scurried about running to and from with one task or another as Ichigo's Ryutsu located Ganju in the kitchen, and the others all gathered in the main sitting room. Ichigo debated briefly between entering the living room immediately or quickly saying hello to his youngest brother, before his decision was made for him as a clatter of pots and pans drew his attention, spelling a smile across his features. The door to the kitchen opened with a smooth rattling sound and Ichigo was greeted with the amusing sight of his younger brother covered in flour staring at a pot simmering over the stove with glaring intensity. The orange-haired Shinigami watched his brother cook for a quiet minute before he turned from the doorway, leaving his brother to concentrate on the food, and made his way towards the sitting room. Pausing outside the doorway, Ichigo observed the rasu of the occupants of the room and took a calming breath as he mentally formed the rough basis of a plan of attack before he slid the door open. The main sitting room, the one they used to entertain guests, was awash in rich shades of deep blue and a pale yellow that complemented the occasional burst of sakura pink nicely. It was all stylized in a heavy Edo-centric fashion that gave Ichigo a brief wave of nostalgia whenever he entered the room. Rurokiyo and her attendants were seated opposite the door, providing them with a tactical advantage. The young heiress was seated in the center with her attendants on either side. Kyan and Kyokaku were perched in front of Ichigo, a low tea table set between the two noble families providing a picturesque idea of a meeting if one could not sense the tension bubbling beneath it all. Gracefully Ichigo seated himself on the other side of Kyan and nodded in greeting to the youth who sat with all the poise and grace of a queen, fingers daintily grasping a cup of tea with thin pinched lips and white knuckles. Kyan turned to face Ichigo, concern lining his features where it pulled at the corners of his mouth and the way he tapped out a relentless rhythm as he raised a questioning brow. Kyokaku studied him with piercing eyes opposite their brother, something tense about her that burned with the same fiery instinct Ichigo had long come to respect and admire. The Shiba captain tapped his fingers once against Zanjitsu's pommel, signifying to his family that everything was okay and that they could speak of everything later. Turning to face the young heiress, Ichigo bowed his head in greeting and said, "Apologies for the delay, Kazumioji-san. The assassins have been apprehended and an official case will be started. Perhaps you could inform us of your situation." Rurokiyo stared at her hands coiled delicately in her lap, a frown furrowing her brow as her attendants blustered and fluttered about Ichigo's forwardness. After a moment of thought, the young heiress glanced from her hands into Ichigo's amber eyes, staring in the lingering silence for a moment before she nodded with a faded smile that was like watercolor spread too thin, beautiful but apparent in its drawn-out state. "My steward Gyokaku Kyunghwa wants to rule my clan. To do so he needs to marry me to my fiancé and then dispose of me, or dispose of me now and fake a will. He is the one producing and selling the Bakuto to the assassins. My mother died during childbirth, and my father was very ill a few years ago and recently passed away, so the mantle of head of the Kazumioji clan has fallen to me. Because I am young, Gyokaku will try to take advantage of me or terminate me, so he can assume power." Kyan beside Ichigo stiffened, and the orange-haired captain could feel the pure fury radiating from his brother at the acts of the Kazumioji clan's steward. The Shiba clan valued family above all else, and such a blatant betrayal of such would stir the wrath of any Shiba. Kyokaku on the other side of Kyan was equally furious for the young heiress before them, though hers was a cold fury, unlike Kyan's burning rage. Ichigo nodded his thanks for the explanation and flashed Rurokiyo a smile for her courage. The Shiba head exhaled sharply for a moment before the shards of glass cutting into his features dispersed, and with the warmth and radiance of 1,000 suns Kyan promised, the Shiba clan would be happy to protect the heir of the Kazumioji clan until evidence is found of this conspiracy and the perpetrators are brought to justice. The Kazumioji clan is thankful for the Shiba clan's offer and will gratefully accept owing them a debt if ever needed." Rurokiyo replied formally, maturity and seriousness clinging to her features like a mantle before it fell away again under the force of a relieved smile. Pouring a cup of tea for himself, Ichigo drank the steaming liquid slowly, contentedly absorbing the warmth before the cup was set down with a careful clink, and Ichigo spoke, "I have delivered the assassins to the 12th Division, who will likely find the physical proof necessary to condemn your former steward. In the meantime, if it is acceptable, Kazumioji-san, my partner and I can investigate as well." Rurokiyo studied Ichigo in thought, green eyes bright and lively with intelligence, before she nodded in a slow careful motion. Allowing a small smile to slip onto his features, Ichigo nodded his thanks and once more sipped at the steaming tea, idly planning how he could convince Byakuya to accompany him on an invasion of a noble family's home. Glancing from the tea, Ichigo watched as Kyan Ever the entertainer began to tell a detailed recounting of the many times Ganja had returned with some strange impossible pet, earning bubbly laughter from the young heiress. Ichigo smiled into his cup, knowing everything would turn out all right, even if they were all exhausted by the end of it all. Again. X. They watched from the shadows of an alcove as an old man in rich crimson robes ornamented with a thick gold lining that glimmered in the night's thick horizon moved his hands in a dramatic manner, one eye glinting as he pointed at sheets and grinned with all the vileness of polluted water. Across from the corrupt steward the leader of the assassins stood, lilac hair a bright contrast to the rich earth tones filling the room and the scar parting his features a jagged flaming red in the oil lamps. They shared a silent glance from their position in the shadows communicating a plan of attack and what the objective of the attack was actually supposed to be as they watched the steward speak to the assassin. It had been a long week, waiting for Sosuke to return with proof of the steward of the Kazumioji clan's betrayal, fighting would-be assassin after assassin, dealing with / teaching Rurakiyo about entitlement and respect, investigating with Byakuya behind the scenes. Then there had been the captain's meetings to clarify the situation and speaking with the Suteiko to gain permission to do everything legally, which in the long run meant less paperwork. In the end, though, it had been worth it all. They had influenced Rurakiyo and she would likely make a great impact on Seoul society, and they had found irredeemable proof. A whisper of Ryotsu against his cheek drew Ichigo's attention and his eyes flickered to Byakuya, whose Kenseikin glimmered fey-like under the moonlight, eyes hooded and features in a mask of duty. They shared a quick nod and Ichigo quirked his lips briefly into a smile before refocusing. With a whisper of the air through paved streets, Ichigo crouched on the opposite side of the window, Reisu pulled tight to his skin as he peered inside. Byakuya mirroring the action on the other side waited for Ichigo to move first. With a challenging grin that lit up his eyes so that they glowed in the deep where they connected with Byakuya's own bright eyes, the orange-haired captain beckoned with a hand over his shoulder. The two captains broke through the window with a shatter of glass that glowed like white fire and was a dissonant harmony in the night, the streets still blanketed by an evening slumber. The cowardice steward let out a high-pitched screech at the sudden intrusion, eyes wide and features white even as he edged back likely towards some hidden weapon. Meanwhile, the assassin unsheathed his katana with a deadly hiss and a frown, taking a step forward to face the two captains. Sharing a quick glance with Byakuya, the orange-haired captain nodded his head once towards the man cowering in the corner and unsheathed Zanjutsu in a fluid motion, Ryotsu filling the room in deadly warning. Byakuya in the same quick manner dodged a rushed lunge with a dagger, easily disarming the old man as he cast a binding kido at the steward, and in the elegant monotone of the Kukaki air intoned, Gyokaku Kyunwa and Hansen Nukui, you are under arrest under the jurisdiction of the Godi I-13 for attempted murder and blackmail of the head of the Kazumioji clan. Surrender quietly and you will receive a fair trial, resist and we will resort to using force. The steward whimpered at Byakuya's feet from where he had fallen, whether from shock or the force of the kido, as the cool tone lilted through the air in a commanding disposition. The leader of the assassins stared at Ichigo with wild furious eyes, blade still held taut at his side as his fingers tightened white-knuckled around the blade. A tense silence filled the small study decorated in rich furniture before the steward struggled to his feet with an angry blotchy red that matched the jewel in his eyes flushing his face as he blustered, "You have no proof. You cannot arrest me." Byakuya chuckled lowly at the steward's vehement denial as Ichigo raised a brow and with a shark-toothed grin commented, "The proof is right here. How else would you explain your meeting with a known assassin who is the leader of the ones attacking the head of the Kazumioji clan? Not to forget that the assassins that have been apprehended have testified to your involvement." Gyokaku paled, all color draining from his features to leave wide eyes that darted accusingly to the assassin before pleadingly to the captain standing before him like judgment incarnate. In the split second where Ichigo's eyes had locked onto that of the traitor, Nukui moved forward in a blur of shunpo blade slithering towards Ichigo's neck with only a whisper of displaced air speaking of the assassin's skill. Ichigo ducked the blade while allowing Zanjutsu to snap up and halt the assassin's movements so as to prevent the blade from impaling the steward who was behind Ichigo, which the man would likely attempt to do to cover his own tracks, hence Byakuya guarding the man. As Ichigo dodged under an overhead swing, he responded with a quick flurry of jabs pushing the assassin towards the far wall and onto the defensive. As he battled the man he recalled that in his timeline the assassin had chosen to serve Gyokaku over Rurakiyo because he saw her as weak, and yet the steward was made of a far less deserving spine in the end. Moving in the tightly enclosed space, Ichigo allowed Zanjutsu to flow from attack to attack, matching the lilac-haired man's attack with practiced ease and vibrant determination. As much as Rurakiyo's whining and self-entitled attitude could be annoying, the girl had a strong character beneath it all and a respect towards her servants that many nobles lacked, and beside that Gyokaku had been quick to whip any typical noble attitudes out of the youth and encourage a bit of chaos in place of dignity. Catching sight of familiar silver eyes watching the battle with careful precision, Ichigo nodded once as he whirled away from the glowing mirror of the assassin's Bakuto. He couldn't allow the man to access his special ability. It would put the steward's life in greater danger, and would make everything a touch more difficult than was necessary. As Ichigo swept under an overhead strike, he responded by shoving Zanjutsu's pommel into the assassin's torso, winding the man and providing the distraction needed for Byakuya to cast a binding Kido, immobilizing the assassin. It wasn't necessarily fair, but in battles with assassins, fair wasn't a concept. Hanzo hunched over on the ground attempting to regain his breath as his Bakuto clattered from his numb hands. The sound of the metal colliding with the wood was like a gunshot in the tense enclosed space of the office. The steward let out a pitiful whine brought low by the collapse of his plans, and knowing that they now had irredeemable proof, the man confessed, "All right, I wanted power and to take over the clan, but I wasn't the one who organized everything. It was someone else, a benefactor, who did it. They were the real mastermind." As Gyokaka spoke, a sly gleam entered his eyes as they flickered between a stack of envelopes knowingly and back to the two captains, some new cunning plan filtering into place. Byakuya blinked a bit wide-eyed in shock at the words, but mostly unsurprised considering what little Ichigo had let slip, and really it had been Byakuya investigating, with Ichigo providing helpful clues and pointers. The captain of the 6th regarded the traitor with narrow eyes that commanded justice along with his imposing presence and stated, "You will still face trial for your part in the conspiracy. Ah, but if I tell you the identity of my benefactor, perhaps my sentence may be lightened." The steward suggested with a leer, in the way that the suggestion was more of a command or blackmail. At the traitor's words, the assassin's head snapped up, eyes wide and brows crinkling, his hands curled into fists at his side. Ichigo felt sympathy for the assassin in the sudden light of revelations of the steward's true character and the whole truth of the matter. Idly the orange-haired captain wondered if the young heiress might accept the assassin into her household once more if he showed convincing remorse, though he would still stand trial first, and it was beyond Ichigo's control whether the man continued to serve the Kazumioji clan. Studying the steward with the weight of his Reisu behind his gaze, Ichigo scrutinized the man before, with Shiro chuckling throughout his mind. The orange-haired Shinigami turned to face his companion and idly commented with a lack of inflection, "He's probably lying to save his own skin. We should turn them into the Onmitsukido's careful care and leave the trial to Soul Society's justice system." "I'm not lying. My benefactor is even a part of your corrupted Godai 13. The steward exclaimed, the jewel in his eye appearing to darken as the man flustered red with indignation. Byakuya cast Ichigo a bemused glance hidden within an elegantly raised brow and the subtle curve of his lips that managed to appear disdainful to an absent observer. Studying the man still sprawled on the floor, Ichigo's hand drifted to his katana and he questioned with cyanide lacing his voice, "Would you be willing to testify in front of the captains and lieutenants of the corrupt Godai 13? The orange-haired Shinigami masked most of the irritation lacing his voice at the suggestion that the Godai 13 was corrupt. It was beyond certain that many of those higher in the Godai 13 hierarchy were strange, but in this timeline, there were no traitors to defile the name of the Godai 13, and Ichigo frankly took pride in that. The steward's one good eye darted around the ornate office, observing everything with the sort of helpless desperation of an animal looking for an escape before a light visibly shone behind the man's eye, and with all the faux innocence the old man could muster, the steward conceded with a nod and a greedy smile. Ichigo nodded, a quiet sigh slipping from his chest as he traded a silent look with Byakuya, who was watching the whole scene play out with calculating eyes. Grabbing the assassin by the back of his Shiakusho and picking up the weapon to tuck into his obi temporarily, Ichigo wordlessly summoned a Jigokuko as Byakuya across from the orange-haired captain picked up the old man with muffled distaste pulling at the corners of his lips. As much as the Kukaki head may have despised his meddling bidding old elders, the man still respected them, and the idea of them betraying the clan was displeasing. Ichigo was just happy most of the Shiba elders were drunkards or your picturesque grandparents. The graceful creature fluttered into the mostly wrecked office a moment later and landed on Ichigo's outstretched hand. Smiling fondly at the dainty creature, Ichigo leaned forward and whispered a message for the Suteiko to call a meeting and another message for Yoryuki. The butterfly drifted from Ichigo's hand and out through the window, and with a glance to his partner to assure everything was okay, Ichigo darted out the window and into the still quiet streets of one of the richer districts of Rungokai, following the path of the Jigokuko. As Ichigo moved swiftly over familiar terracotta roofing, the assassin remained a dead weight against his back, and feeling curiosity peck at his insides, Ichigo questioned, "Why did you betray your clan?" The assassin remained quiet as the wind whipped by, and Ichigo had the sixth sense the assassin was likely flipping Ichigo a rude gesture in response to his question, but he ignored it as they drew ever closer to the Godai 13, sprawling buildings of white rising in the distance a familiar sight. A minute later the assassin, with a low rumble of muffled words drenched in something like petulance if the drawn-out word were any indication, said, "Ruroki Yosama was too weak." Ichigo nodded at the words spoken with a distinct lack of real emotion as they landed close to the first division, knowing that strength was everything to some people, whether physical or that of willpower. Running a finger over Zanjutsu's polished hilt, Ichigo murmured with a tone laced with experience earned in thought, "Sometimes character of strength is far greater than what we can physically see, especially when we haven't finished growing, though I doubt it would meet your standards in any circumstance." Byakuya landed behind Ichigo a moment later with the clatter of sandaled feet upon the cobblestone. In the rushing quiet of the night the steward's voice, cajoling and bargaining, was as loud as the croaking of frogs by a pond and just as irritating. The large doors to the first swung open with illusionary ease, well-oiled hinge creaking slightly under the weight of the doors in any case. "Got yourself another catch, I see, Ichi," Shinji commented with a grin where he was leaning against one of the pillars with carefully manicured nonchalance balanced throughout his lax shoulders and cocky grin. Ichigo only chuckled and nodded in response as he entered the first, Byakuya following behind him with muffled amusement of his own seeping into his reisu beneath a thin veneer of annoyance. "Most of the others are already here, though some of the lieutenants had to be wrangled from their beds and the like." Shinji chortled as he followed them, amber eyes glowing in the low light the oil lamps provided, as Ichigo could hear Byakuya mumble half-heartedly about extra weight behind the orange-haired Shinigami. Nodding his thanks to Shinji, who had delivered the information, the three captains, plus the accused, paced quickly through the long halls of the first until they arrived at the large doors that marked the meeting room. Ichigo could feel the many captains and lieutenants gathered inside, a sea of reisu as bright and colorful as any on Earth, filled with various personalities and the like. Shinji winked at the captain of the 10th and the captain of the 6th before quietly slipping into the meeting room near unnoticed, likely hoping to escape nagging from Hiyori or Love's light chiding and providing the opportunity for a dramatic entrance. Byakuya's silver eyes caught Ichigo's own as they waited for a quiet moment, the steward having fallen silent and the assassin like a rag doll, quietly with a tilt of his head and lines dodging at his eyes. Byakuya questioned if his partner was all right. Ichigo responded with a small smile that extended to his eyes before the expression was wiped away with a clean nod, and the large doors to the meeting room shuddered open. Silence fell where previously inane chatter had filled the void at the sight of the two captains with an old man and an assassin slung over the shoulders. In all honesty, Ichigo knew it was likely a comedic sight, but a respectful silence filled the room nonetheless as Ichigo and Byakuya entered. The Suteiko at the head of the room slammed his staff onto the ground, commanding attention and quieting any whispers before they could start. Piercing coal eyes stared at Ichigo from beneath heavy brows as the old man bowed his head in a barely imperceptible manner and said, "Shiba Teiko, Kukaki Teiko, you have requested an emergency meeting in correlation to the Kazumioji conspiracy. Please state your reasoning." In well-practiced unison, Ichigo and Byakuya set the steward and the assassin on the ground before surveying the gathered captains and lieutenants. Ichigo's gaze lingered on Amagai hidden in the shadows and watching everything with a passive expression, before he returned his attention to the room at large and stated, "Before you are the steward of the Kazumioji clan, and the leader of the assassins sent after the head of the Kazumioji clan, when they were apprehended today based on sufficient evidence gathered by Aizen Teiko and ourselves." The steward revealed that a member of the Godai 13, likely of the upper hierarchy, was the benefactor of the steward's conspiracy. Whispers broke out in a great flurry at Ichigo's revelation, and suspicion was cast about the room as the eyes of the crowd turned to one individual after another. In the midst of the chaos, Ichigo watched Amagai carefully in case the man decided to act upon the abundant chaos. A large crack echoed throughout the room, silencing the growing hysteria in one quick motion. All eyes turned to face the Suteiko, whose eyes glowed with liquid fire even as he nodded for Ichigo continue. "The steward has asked for leniency for himself and his comrade in exchange for the name of the traitor," Ichigo stated, simply watching as the old man jerked slightly in surprise at Ichigo's wording and the assassin's hands once more formed into tightly clenched fists. The gathered captains and lieutenants studied the accused with all the unsettling force a crowd of powerful beings could possess, even as Amagai stepped deeper into the shadows, hand straying to his katana. The Suteiko nodded once in agreement, acquiescing to the demand, and wordlessly Yoriyuki stepped out of the line of captains, Swaifon and another lieutenant, thankfully not the idiot from Ichigo's timeline, followed the feline captain to stand before the accused. All eyes focused on the steward whose thin hands with parchment-like skin shook visibly where they clenched at his kimono. The man bowed his head for a moment before he glanced into the eyes of the Suteiko and began, "The traitor is in this very room." Before the steward could finish, a wave of Reisu floored the room, sparking upon the air with oppressive heat, forcing the old man to collapse. Amagai stepped into the center of the room, Bakuto held at the ready while his katana remained sheathed. Ichigo muffled a curse under his breath at the appearance of the Bakuto, knowing it was dangerous, perhaps more so in a room full of Shinigami, especially if the Suteiko or the man released their Bankai. All eyes centered on Amagai as the traitor focused his attention on the Suteiko, the temperature in the room rising in a slow inferno as Amagai stated, "My father's name was Shinetsu Kisaragi, and it is through your blade that my father was killed." Amagai's voice was heavy with accusation, his posture a stiff line of outrage as across from the man the Suteiko regarded the traitor with a heavy brow, a frown tugging at the old man's lips as his hand strayed ever slowly towards the hilt of Ryujinjaka and replied, "Your father was overtaken by his Bakuto during his investigation into the Kazumioji clan. To save him from a half-life I killed him." Yamamoto's old voice, rough with age, was heavy with remorse but clear and concise nonetheless as the ancient Shinigami stared into the eyes of Amagai. Features that were usually carved into strict sternness like a statue were open and accepting of the young man's anger. Silently under Yoriuki's careful eye, the 2nd Division members removed the steward and assassin from the room as the heat continued to rise and the captains and lieutenants regarded the brewing situation with tense and wary eyes. Suddenly the Bakuto in Amagai's hand pulsed green as he maneuvered the blade in front of him, his expression invisible to Ichigo's eyes even as his movements were jerky and stiff like a marionette with broken strings. With a pulse of Reisu, the captains and lieutenants Zanpakuto were rendered immobile and the man darted from the room in a wicked flash of Shunpo. Ignoring the aching tear in Ichigo's chest at not being able to feel Zanjutsu, the way his eyes burned, and his thoughts streamlined into panic, Ichigo nodded once to the Suteiko, encouraging him to follow and reassuring that Ichigo could handle it. He knew it was the old man's fight. The Suteiko nodded, gratitude shifting like embers in his eyes, and followed the traitor in a burst of Ryutsu, leaving a meeting room full of panicked Shinigami. With a flare of hollow Ryutsu that spread to every corner and snapped at the negative emotions filling the room, Ichigo successfully caught the attention of the panicking captains and lieutenants. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo's hand casually rested on Zanjutsu's hilt in silent self-reassurance even as he looked into the eyes of his comrades and commanded, "Everyone please calm down. Your connection with your Zanpakuto will return within a few minutes. Please leave the matter of the traitor in the Suteiko's hands and return to your divisions. A message will be sent to everyone when the situation is finished. In the meantime, we cannot allow Soul Society to be defenseless while we run about in panic." At Ichigo's words, many of the Shinigami who were frozen as if having seen Medusa relaxed, nodding quietly to themselves or regarding their Zanpakuto with careful concerned eyes. The orange-haired captain had long ago learned that without orders and reasoning people would continue to panic, though panic would always occur regardless. The Shinigami lingered for a few moments, huddling in groups to reassure each other or speak in quiet whispers as if the situation didn't hang above their heads, an executioner's axe waiting to fall. Flaring his Reisu once more in reminder, Ichigo watched as some of the captains and lieutenants flashed Ichigo guilty smiles before disappearing in a burst of Shunpo. As the others began to file out of the room, Byakuya stepped up beside Ichigo and wordlessly let his fingers drift across Ichigo's own for a sparse second before returning to the hilt of Senbonzakura. "Mama Ichi, yet another show of your excellent aptitude for captaincy. Maybe you can be the Suteiko when Yamamoto finally retires." Kairo Raku said in his familiar low drawl with a coy smile and wink shadowed from beneath the brim of his hat as he approached with Jushiro. A weariness furrowed the expressions of both captains, hidden though it was making Ichigo's heart echo with empathy, while behind them Kayan was bickering fondly with Rukia and Nano was glaring silently at her captain while Lisa read a magazine. In lieu of the comment, Ichigo delivered his close friend a dry glare, dry as the Sahara Desert. It was well known among the upper hierarchy that Ichigo was only waiting for the right moment to shuck his captaincy at his lieutenant, who was also glaring at Ichigo, likely for yet again being involved in some new plot. Shunsui only laughed at Ichigo's glare, the corners of his eyes crinkling in fond warm amusement, while Jushiro smiled into the sleeve of his Shiakusho with knowing eyes that winked with mischief. Glancing around the now empty hall, Ichigo let his Reisu reach out, searching for the Suteiko who was fighting Amagai on top of Sokioku Hill. What a surprise! As his senses reached out, he could feel Zanjitsu's returning presence, his Zanpakuto's concern and warmth like a bomb to frantic thoughts shoved hurriedly under the rug. When Ichigo returned his attention to the Shinigami in front of him, it was to the amusement of everyone. Kyan regarded Ichigo with a knowing look that was drenched in concern, while Lisa was rolling her eyes at him, and Byakuya had pressed himself closer to Ichigo. It was Shunsui who made a shooing motion with his hands, Jushiro nodding beside him, and said, "Go make sure Yamgi doesn't retire early." The words were spoken with faux casualty as Shunsui's brows furrowed and a barely there frown caught at the man's lips as his hands worriedly stroked at Katen Kyokotsu's handles. Ichigo glanced briefly to Byakuya in indecision, wanting to support his friends as much as he wanted to be there for the man who had become like a grandfather to him. Byakuya, with a knowing smile lightly dawning his features, bumped his shoulder with Ichigo and nodded his eyes, conveying 1,000 parting words that Ichigo responded to with a wave of Reisu and a grin. Aye, Captain. Stay safe everyone," Ichigo said in farewell, winking at Shunsui and Jushiro before he pivoted and let a burst of Ryotsu alight beneath his feet as he moved towards Sokioka Hill. The heat surrounding the large landmark was intense, near blistering as it drove at Ichigo's lungs and made his eyes water where he spotted the Suteiko and Amigai ensconced upon the hill in a sea of roiling fire. Pulling his Reisu around himself, Ichigo touched lightly onto the ground devoid of all grass but now bearing a motley mix of sand and ash as Zanjitsu whispered in his mind. The Suteiko was facing Amigai even with Ryujinjaka sealed, the heat providing no effect to the old man, who had long ago become resistant to heat. Ichigo almost wished for the same as the very air crackled with fire, oxygen burning away at a rapid rate. The battle was concluding. Both opponents were panting and Ichigo could see a few small wounds decorating the Suteiko's body and a large gash stretched across Amigai's torso. There was a revelation in the man's wide eyes and a loosely held katana as he faced the Suteiko with tears gathering. The old man radiated an aura of sorrow and solemn apology that reminded Ichigo intensely of one of the nights in the Winter War when he had been visited by the grim old man. "You could repay your father's actions and fight with the Gotei 13, we need good soldiers, good men like you. There is a war coming and we all need to stay together if we want to live. Your father should not have died, but neither should you so carelessly throw your life away, you have the chance to live to use it," Yamamoto stated slowly, voice rough and dragging with exhaustion but burned with a passion all the same that echoed in the old man's straight spine and the near-visible aura of Ryotsu that surrounded the man in a shimmering mirage of heat. Amigai stared at the Suteiko for a moment in silence before he slumped to his knees defeated and his hands reached up to cover his eyes as sobs racked his body. With a flicker of the wind the flames began to die out around them and inhaling in slight relief, Ichigo walked forward to stand beside the Suteiko, a healing Kido already dancing around his hands in wisps of green. The Suteiko turned to Ichigo as he approached, and a smile graced the old man's lips, shaping his face in a way few rarely saw, eyes warm like a hearth and just as providing. Ichigo grinned in return as Zanjitsu hummed proudly in his mind and Amigai slowly dried his tears regarding the world as if seeing it for what it was once more, the fog of death stripped away. Anohana would likely lecture them all for smoke inhalation and injuries, but they had avoided yet another causality and Ichigo couldn't stop the relief that plundered the worry and stole it away to replace it with a lingering happiness. Check the description for the links to the author.